Welcome to Nocturne Historia. Japan, a land of nearly 7,000 islands scattered across the western Pacific Ocean, was born in isolation. Surrounded by treacherous seas and crowned with volcanic peaks, this rugged archipelago nurtured a civilization that evolved largely apart from its continental neighbors, yet never completely severed from them. This natural barrier didn't just protect Japan, it shaped a world where culture, warfare, and philosophy took on uniquely Japanese forms. Here, among steep mountains and narrow coastal plains, the samurai tradition was born. The term samurai derives from the word saburo, meaning to serve, a concept that extended far beyond mere military duty. To serve meant to dedicate one's life to a lord, to a code, and to a vision of honor that would define Japanese society for centuries. The land itself helped forge this identity. With 80% of Japan cloaked in volcanic mountains, local regions developed in relative seclusion, each with its own flavor of culture and governance. Rivers rushed down valleys, feeding rice paddies stitched across thin strips of arable land. The surrounding sea was both guardian and gatekeeper, keeping invaders at bay while allowing selective influences from China and Korea to drift ashore. Out of this crucible emerged a society like no other, where warlords debated poetry and warriors practiced calligraphy with the same discipline they wielded a sword. Japan's feudal history stretches back over 2,000 years and unfolds like a layered scroll. Stories of loyalty and betrayal, cultural brilliance amidst brutal warfare, and a rigid hierarchy that paradoxically allowed moments of unexpected mobility. The samurai were the architects of this world. Not merely soldiers, they were administrators, educators, and moral exemplars who upheld a social code rooted in Bushido, the way of the warrior. Within this world, you could hear temple bells echoing through valleys, the soft rustle of silk in imperial courts, and the thundering cries of warriors on blood-soaked fields. Zen monks meditated behind temple walls, while daimyo plotted conquests inside fortress keeps. In one moment, the brush of a master calligrapher glided across rice paper. In the next, the steel of a katana flashed beneath the cherry blossoms. The duality was not seen as contradiction, but as harmony. But long before the rise of the samurai, the seeds of Japanese culture were already being planted. During the last ice age, humans crossed land bridges from the Asian mainland and settled these islands. These early settlers formed the Jomon culture, known for creating some of the world's oldest pottery and for living in tune with the rhythms of forest and sea. Their deep spiritual respect for nature and unseen forces laid the foundation for Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, and infused Japanese identity with a profound sensitivity to the natural world. They built pit dwellings in small villages, hunted game in the forests, fished the surrounding waters, and performed rituals with clay figurines known as dogu. From around 14,500 to 900 BCE, the Jomon culture thrived, its cord-marked pottery revealing both artistic flair and practical skill. Then came change. Around 900 BCE, waves of new migrants from the mainland sparked a dramatic cultural revolution, the Yayoi period. These newcomers brought revolutionary tools: wet rice agriculture, metalworking, and weaving. Bronze and iron weapons appeared, settlements expanded, food surpluses grew, and with them, so did social complexity. The Japanese archipelago was now undergoing a transformation that would echo through its history. From the earliest villagers who revered wind and forest to the samurai who revered honor and steel, Japan's story was already taking shape. Rice farming wasn't just backbreaking work, it was a social revolution. As early Japanese communities adopted wet rice agriculture, the need for coordinated labor and complex irrigation systems pushed them to organize more hierarchically. Leadership naturally gravitated toward those who could mobilize and manage people, and over time, powerful clan leaders emerged. These early social hierarchies laid the groundwork for political centralization across the Japanese islands. Chinese records from the 3rd century tell us about this formative time. They describe a land called Wa, home to over 100 small, fragmented states. But amid this fractured landscape, one figure stood out: Queen Himiko. She ruled a federation of states from a place called Yamatai. But she wasn't just a political leader. According to the chronicles, she was also a shamaness who practiced divination. This fusion of spiritual and secular authority was deeply rooted in early Japanese governance, where legitimacy was as much about divine connection as it was about force or lineage. By the 4th century, this evolving social order began to leave grand, visible marks on the land. Massive burial mounds, known as kofun, some over 400 meters long, started appearing. These keyhole-shaped tombs, often surrounded by moats and filled with luxurious grave goods, signaled the rise of powerful elites. Inside, archaeologists have found weapons, horse gear, mirrors, and ornamental treasures. Such findings not only reflect growing wealth, but also the increasing significance of military might, a trait that would echo into the age of the samurai. These tombs don't just tell us who held power, they tell us where that power came from. Horse trappings and imported items from Korea and China point to intense contact with the mainland. Between 250 and 538 CE, during what we now call the Kofun period, Japan was far from isolated. Bronze mirrors, iron weapons, and gold ornaments found in these mounds exhibit mainland artistic styles. This exchange wasn't limited to objects. It included ideas, religions, and writing. Perhaps the most transformative import was writing itself. Initially, Chinese characters were used strictly to write the Chinese language. But over time, the Japanese began to adapt them phonetically to suit their own spoken tongue. It was a clumsy, complicated process, but it set the foundation for Japan's unique writing system, a blend of borrowed forms and native innovation. The ability to write didn't arrive until centuries after many of these events took place. That means Japan's earliest stories survived first as oral tradition. It wasn't until the 8th century that these myths and memories were committed to paper. Two major works, the Kojiki, completed in 712, and the Nihon Shoki in 720, combine myth with early political history. They tell of gods creating the islands, of the divine origin of the imperial family from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and of the early rulers who set the foundations of Japan's national identity. These stories weren't just for entertainment, and they were powerful tools for legitimizing the rule of the Yamato court by linking their bloodline directly to the heavens. At the same time, these chronicles give us rare glimpses into the everyday life, beliefs, and customs of early Japanese society. At the heart of that society was rice. It wasn't just food, it was currency, tribute, and sacred gift. The rhythms of rice cultivation dictated the rhythm of life itself. Festivals and rituals marked planting and harvest, weaving spiritual meaning into the changing seasons. This deep connection to nature, to cycles of growth and decay, would come to shape Japanese aesthetics, including the later worldview of the samurai, who saw beauty in impermanence and grace in discipline. Trade during this era also expanded. While Japan is a mountainous country riddled with natural barriers, its coastline offered maritime highways that linked distant communities. Goods like pottery, obsidian, salt, and seafood flowed through these networks. With them came ideas and innovations. Chinese coins, Korean ceramics, and other artifacts found across the islands show that Japan, though geographically remote, was never entirely cut off. In fact, its geography may have helped it. The combination of mountain ranges and surrounding seas allowed Japan to control how and when it engaged with foreign cultures. This selective adaptation, taking what worked, reshaping it, and making it Japanese, became a hallmark of the country's development. At the same time, the rugged terrain divided Japan into many isolated regions. Local rulers began to develop their own identities and power bases. This regional fragmentation helped sow the seeds of the feudal order that would eventually dominate Japanese political life. From Queen Himiko's spiritual rule to the Grand Kofun tombs, from imported Chinese characters to rice festivals that shaped time itself, early Japan was already building the foundation for a civilization that was both deeply local and broadly connected. By the time Japan began deliberately closing its doors to foreign contact during the later era of samurai rule, the cultural foundations of the country had already been laid centuries earlier. These foundations blended Japan's native traditions, like ancestor worship and reverence for nature, with carefully chosen foreign influences. Even in this early period, you could already see the roots of key aspects of Japanese society: a strict social hierarchy, power tied to agricultural wealth, and a rising emphasis on military strength. These ingredients would eventually feed into the emergence of a centralized state, and with it, the rise of a warrior aristocracy we now know as the samurai. But before all that, One clan rose to prominence and forever changed Japan's destiny: the Yamato. During the 4th and 5th centuries, the Yamato clan consolidated control over central Japan. What made them different wasn't just military prowess. They claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, giving their leadership divine legitimacy. With this sacred lineage, they unified rival clans through a mix of force, strategic marriages, and religious authority. And with that, the Japanese imperial line was born, a lineage that, remarkably, continues unbroken to this day. The Yamato didn't govern alone, though. They established a loose federation with powerful regional clans called Uji. These Uji retained control over their own lands and specialized in specific hereditary roles: religious rites, crafts, governance, but all acknowledged the emperor as their symbolic leader. He performed sacred ceremonies believed to secure harmony and prosperity for the entire realm. Then, in the year 538, a momentous change arrived from across the sea. The Korean kingdom of Baekje sent the Yamato court a remarkable gift: Buddhist scriptures, a statue of the Buddha, and ritual objects. Along with the faith came more than just religion. There were technologies, political philosophies, and writing systems from the Chinese continent. Naturally, this sparked deep divisions. Some conservative clans insisted on preserving Shinto purity, while others saw in Buddhism a powerful path towards civilizational advancement. After a period of conflict, Buddhism gained imperial backing and began reshaping Japanese culture from the inside. The man who championed this transformation was Prince Shotoku. Serving as regent from 594 to 622, he not only sponsored the construction of great Buddhist temples, but also sent emissaries and students to China to absorb its advanced systems. More importantly, he issued Japan's first written political document, the 17-article Constitution. While it wasn't a constitution in the modern sense, it laid out moral principles inspired by Confucianism: harmony, respect for superiors, and a duty-bound government. It marked a major step toward a centralized, morally guided administration. Then, in 645, a dramatic political coup led to the implementation of the Taika reforms. Modeled on the powerful Tang dynasty of China, these reforms reimagined Japanese governance from the ground up. They declared all land to be imperial property and introduced a system of land redistribution that reallocated fields every 6 years based on household size. Japan was divided into provinces, districts, and villages, each managed by appointed officials responsible for collecting taxes, conscripting soldiers, and maintaining order. At the heart of this new order was the Ritsuryo system, a legal administrative code that assigned ranks, defined responsibilities, and codified both punishment and ceremony. To support this centralized vision, Japan established its first true capital city at Heijō-kyo, modern-day Nara, meticulously modeled on China's capital, Chang'an. With broad ceremonial avenues and formal planning, it was a visible expression of Japan's new direction, one of order, centralization, and imperial authority. These transformations didn't just change laws, they changed the very shape of Japan's identity. Around the late 8th century, the Japanese capital emerged as a masterpiece of planning. Broad streets laid out in a precise grid, monumental temples rising above the skyline, and government buildings reflecting ambition and order. At the heart of it all stood Todaiji, the great temple housing a bronze Buddha over 15 meters tall, a spiritual colossus that embodied the rising confidence and wealth of the early Japanese state. Yet, despite these bold reforms inspired by Chinese models, Japan's political landscape remained stubbornly unique. Rugged geography and primitive roads made centralized control nearly impossible in remote provinces. Local aristocrats, powerful families with deep roots, continued to dominate both court and countryside, gradually turning once imperial offices into family inheritances. One of the boldest reforms, the equal field land redistribution system, proved too idealistic. Over time, it collapsed under the weight of practical difficulties, and new legal loopholes allowed powerful clans to rebuild vast private estates. But this wasn't just an age of failed policies. It was a time of profound cultural synthesis. Instead of displacing native Shinto beliefs, Buddhism merged with them in a dynamic fusion. The kami, spirits of nature and ancestors, were seen as protectors or manifestations of Buddhist deities. This syncretism, This ability to blend rather than erase became a defining feature of Japanese culture. You can see this blending not only in religion, but in poetry. The Manyoshu, collection of 10,000 leaves, compiled in the 8th century, was Japan's first great poetry anthology. Written by everyone from emperors to frontier guards, these poems capture the quiet intensity of human emotion and a deep reverence for nature, themes that would one day shape the world view of the samurai. Meanwhile, Japanese artisans were mastering techniques borrowed from the continent, architecture, sculpture, painting, but gradually shaping them into something uniquely Japanese. Calligraphy and court music evolved into refined, distinctly local forms. In government, literary Chinese became the standard for writing, even as Japan began experimenting with using Chinese characters phonetically to write its own spoken language. Politically, the Ritsuryo system codified ranks and roles in the court, setting a template that would echo through centuries. Provincial governors and local officials foreshadowed the later rise of daimyo and their loyal samurai, a pattern of central authority coexisting with strong regional powers, a tension that would define Japanese feudalism. Though true samurai had not yet emerged, early professional warriors were already gaining prominence, especially in frontier areas where indigenous unrest required martial discipline. These early fighters were more like police and guards than elite warriors, but their growing importance marked a turning point. And then, in 794, a critical shift. Emperor Kanmu moved the capital to Heian-kyo, modern-day Kyoto, partly to escape the overwhelming influence of Buddhist temples. This new capital, designed according to Chinese geomantic principles, would remain Japan's imperial heart for over 1,000 years. Streets were laid in perfect order. The imperial palace sat at the northern axis. Aristocratic mansions filled the south. Buddhist temples, no longer politically dominant, were strategically placed to protect the city from spiritual harm. At the summit of Heian society stood the emperor, surrounded by a small elite of court nobles who held the highest government offices. These aristocrats, perhaps only a few thousand, crafted a courtly culture of exquisite refinement. Their world revolved around beauty, poetry, ritual, and sophistication, creating an aesthetic ideal that would echo through Japan's future centuries. This was a turning point, where ambition, belief, artistry, and power began weaving the fabric of Japanese civilization. In the elegant world of Heian Japan, court life was the very center of aristocratic identity. Rank was everything, and one's position was silently communicated through intricate layers of clothing, mannered gestures, and courtly language. The elite didn't simply value beauty, they lived it. Poetry, music, calligraphy, and an exquisite sensitivity to nature were not hobbies, but essential traits of a cultivated noble. Interestingly, aristocratic women enjoyed an unusual level of influence for the time. They received rich educations and played significant cultural roles, producing some of the era's most enduring literary masterpieces. Most famously, Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji, often hailed as the world's first novel, offered profound psychological insight and poetic beauty, capturing the melancholic spirit of the age. This spirit was deeply rooted in the aesthetic of Mono no Aware, a gentle sorrow in the face of life's transience, symbolized by fleeting cherry blossoms or autumn leaves. But behind the calm elegance of court poetry, politics churned. The Fujiwara clan mastered power through marriage, placing their daughters in the imperial bedchamber and ruling behind the scenes as regents. Fujiwara no Michinaga, the dynasty's towering figure, was effectively the ruler of Japan while preserving the illusion of imperial sovereignty. He proudly wrote in his diary, "This world, I think, is indeed my world." Yet as the Fujiwara basked in cultural refinement, cracks were forming in the political structure. The Ritsuryo system, designed to regulate land and taxes, began to erode. Temples, shrines, and aristocrats gained control of private, tax-exempt estates known as Shogun. These estates slipped from central control, managed instead by local families who began building independent power bases. Governors sent from the capital were increasingly absentee landlords, reliant on provincial agents to run affairs. Over time, these local managers consolidated power. Governorships, once rotated among nobles, became hereditary and autonomous. The imperial court, preoccupied with ceremonial matters, slowly lost its grip on the provinces. To restore order, they began appointing warriors, men of arms, as provincial officials. But these military figures weren't mere tools of the court. They built their own followings and authority, laying the foundation for a new social order. This was the birth of the samurai, the warriors who served as state managers and noble landlords, protecting their lands and interests. Though originally low in social status, samurai clans began to develop distinct values: loyalty, martial discipline, and practical governance. Their identity diverged sharply from the poetry-loving courtiers in Kyoto. Among them, two great families rose to power, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both traced their lineage to emperors and had long histories of military service. As unrest grew, these warrior clans emerged as political contenders. The Taira, under the formidable Taira no Kiyomori, crushed rival factions during the Hogan and Heiji rebellions, earning him unprecedented influence in the court. What began as an attempt to defend aristocratic rule was now the slow emergence of a warrior-led Japan. The world of cherry blossoms and court poetry had given rise to swords, strategy, and the samurai. Taira no Kiyomori was more than a warrior. He was a political force who shattered centuries of aristocratic tradition. He became the first military man to ascend to the highest ranks of the imperial court, positions once exclusive to the Fujiwara and other noble families. When he married his daughter to the emperor and his grandson ascended the throne as Emperor Antoku, it marked the zenith of Taira power and a turning point in Japanese history. But Kiyomori's rapid rise bred resentment. Provincial warrior families saw the Taira's grip on power as unjust, while traditional nobles in Kyoto viewed these military upstarts with disdain. Meanwhile, the Minamoto clan, previously defeated and diminished, was quietly regaining strength in the east under the leadership of Minamoto no Yoritomo. The stage was set for a monumental clash that would not only decide the fate of two powerful clans, but also usher in a new era of Japanese politics. The cultural gap between the Kyoto aristocracy and the warriors of the provinces had grown stark. While courtiers wrote verses about falling cherry blossoms, provincial warriors fought brutal battles for land and honor. Yet over time, the refined aesthetics of court life began to influence the rising samurai elite. These warriors adopted aristocratic customs, appreciating poetry, beauty, and subtle rituals, even as they remained grounded in the harsh realities of war and governance. This unique blend of martial skill and cultured sensibility would become a defining feature of samurai identity in the centuries ahead. Ironically, the court's own devotion to the transience of life, the fleeting beauty of a withering flower, seemed to foreshadow its decline. As the 12th century progressed, provincial warriors no longer accepted imperial authority as absolute. The days of unquestioned court dominance were ending. In 1180, tensions between the Taira and Minamoto exploded into full-scale war. This 5-year conflict, the Genpei War, would permanently change the balance of power in Japan. It began when Prince Mochihito, a son of the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, who had been denied succession, issued a call to arms against the Taira. Though he was swiftly captured and killed, his message struck a chord with discontented warriors across the provinces, especially among Minamoto loyalists. Minamoto no Yoritomo, then exiled in Izu, seized the moment. Initially hesitant, he raised his banner in rebellion and began rallying support from eastern warrior families. He established his base in Kamakura, a defensible site near modern Tokyo, from which he would lead a growing coalition of samurai and quietly lay the foundation for a new political order. Early in the war, the Taira retained the upper hand. They held Kyoto and controlled imperial authority. Yoritomo's first military effort ended in defeat at the Battle of Ishibashiyama. But elsewhere, the tide was turning. His cousin Minamoto no Yoshinaka led a successful campaign in central Japan, eventually capturing Kyoto in 1183 and forcing the Taira to flee with the child emperor Entoku. Yet Yoshinaka's unruly conduct in the capital alienated the court nobility. His reckless behavior prompted Yoritomo to dispatch his younger brother, the brilliant tactician Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to confront him. Yoshitsune defeated and killed Yoshinaka in 1184, asserting Yoritomo's dominance over the fractured Minamoto clan. Now in control, Yoshitsune launched a campaign against the retreating Taira. The final confrontation came at sea. In 1185, the two fleets met in the Shimonoseki Strait at the Battle of Dan no Ura. The Minamoto navy decisively defeated the Taira. As their ships sank, many Taira warriors, including the young Emperor Entoku, chose to drown rather than face capture. The war was over, the Taira were shattered, those who survived fled to remote provinces or were executed. With their fall, a new political reality emerged. Japan was no longer governed by the imperial court alone. Power now belonged to the warriors. The Genpei War was more than a bloody struggle between rival clans. It was the crucible in which the samurai identity was forged. The battles between the Minamoto and the Taira became the stuff of legend, immortalized in epic tales and no dramas, where ghostly warriors returned from watery graves. This war transformed the very nature of Japanese warfare. Gone were the small skirmishes of earlier times. Instead, thousands of mounted warriors clashed in open battles, fleets engaged in brutal naval combat, and strongholds fell to methodical siege operations. The battlefield saw both ritualized duels between champions and the rise of coordinated military strategy. At the heart of it all stood the mounted samurai archer, for whom the bow, not the sword, was the weapon of choice. The iconic curved sword, so symbolic of the samurai in later centuries, was initially a backup, drawn only when arrows ran out or enemies closed in. The war also birthed a pantheon of heroic figures. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, brilliant and doomed, became the model of the tragic warrior genius. His companion Benkei, a towering warrior monk who stood by him until the bitter end, came to symbolize absolute, unshakable loyalty. Even their enemies, like Taira no Tomomori, who chose death over dishonor by tying himself to an anchor and leaping into the sea, embodied the code of valor that would shape samurai ideals for generations. When the Minamoto finally triumphed, Minamoto no Yoritomo did not simply return power to the emperor. Instead, he broke with tradition and created something entirely new, a military government headquartered not in Kyoto, but far away in Kamakura. In 1192, Yoritomo received the title Seitai Shogun, great general who subdues the barbarians. Previously a temporary rank, Yoritomo made it the foundation of a permanent regime. His government, known as the Bakufu, or tent government, marked the birth of Japan's feudal age. The emperor remained a sacred figure, but true power now lay with the shogun. Yoritomo placed trusted retainers across the provinces as constables and stewards, forging a direct link between local governance and his military authority. This dual power structure, imperial and shogunal, would define Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries. At the core of this new system was a deeply personal bond, lord and vassal. Warriors pledged loyalty to Yoritomo and in return received official rights to their lands. These agreements were formalized in written oaths, creating a rigid hierarchy of protection and obligation. Though it echoed patron-client ties of earlier Japanese society, the structure closely resembled the feudal bonds developing in medieval Europe, with a distinct Japanese character. With the Kamakura shogunate, the samurai were no longer just servants of aristocrats. They were the new ruling class. The court nobles in Kyoto still held cultural prestige and conducted ceremonial rites, but they were increasingly politically irrelevant. Power now belonged to those who commanded armies, distributed land, and rewarded service. A new social order had emerged, with the samurai at the top. Their values, martial excellence, loyalty unto death, austerity, and administrative discipline, became the ideals of leadership, overshadowing the delicate courtly virtues of poetry and art. And yet the relationship between these two worlds was not one of outright rejection. Even as they secured political dominance, samurai adopted aspects of aristocratic culture. They wrote poetry, practiced calligraphy, and engaged in religious devotion. In time, this fusion of martial rigor and refined taste became the soul of the samurai ethos. The Genpei War had changed everything: military structure, political authority, and social hierarchy. But perhaps just as important, it reshaped Japan's cultural imagination. The fall of the Taira and the rise of the Minamoto were captured in one of Japan's greatest literary epics, the Heike Monogatari. This war tale did more than recount battles. It preserved the memory of a civilization in transition, where valor and loss, honor and tragedy became enduring national themes. Before it was written down, the Heike Monogatari, Japan's Great War epic, was sung by blind minstrels, accompanied by the mournful strums of the biwa lute. Its opening line, "The sound of the Gion Shoja bells echoes the impermanence of all things," encapsulated the Buddhist belief that glory, like blossoms in spring, is fleeting. The tale chronicled the rise and fall of the Taira clan, blending history with Buddhist themes of karmic retribution and impermanence. It warned that even the mightiest, like the Taira, must eventually fall. After his victory, Minamoto no Yoritomo ruled with strength and vision. But in 1199, he died from a fall from his horse. His sons, who succeeded him as shoguns, were assassinated in a series of shadowy political intrigues. In their place rose the Hojo clan, Yoritomo's in-laws, who would not claim the title of shogun themselves but instead rule as regents for puppet shoguns. Despite the bloodshed the system Yoritomo established endured. Under the Kamakura shogunate, Japan entered a new era, an era not just of warriors, but of samurai rule institutionalized into government. What had begun as Yoritomo's personal military headquarters evolved into a sophisticated regime. The Bakufu now housed administrative bureaus, legal courts, and councils of warlords. Central to this system was the Samurai Dokoro, or Board of Retainers, which managed vassal relations, documented landholdings, and resolved disputes between warriors. It was governance by discipline, efficiency, and pragmatism, starkly different from the ceremonial elegance of the imperial court. After Yoritomo's death, power gradually consolidated in the hands of the Hojo. His son Yori was likely assassinated by Hojo agents. His second son, Sanetomo, was murdered at a shrine by his own nephew. With Sanetomo's death in 1219, the Hojo dispensed with pretense. They installed imperial princes or Fujiwara nobles as nominal shoguns, while ruling directly through the office of shikin, regent to the shogun. Japan now operated through layers of symbolic legitimacy. The emperor delegated to a shogun, who was in turn controlled by a regent. This veiling of real power behind ceremonial offices became a hallmark of Japanese political philosophy for centuries. Even as power shifted from house to house, the principle remained: legitimacy through tradition, governance through pragmatism. The Kamakura shogunate ruled through a web of loyal vassals known as gokinin, housemen, who swore fealty to the shogun in exchange for rights to their land and local authority. The Bakufu appointed jito, or land stewards, to manage taxation, and shugo, or constables, to maintain provincial order and mobilize forces in times of war. This structure created centralized oversight adapted to Japan's fractured geography and limited infrastructure. One of the most innovative features of the Kamakura regime was its legal system. The Bakufu established permanent courts to adjudicate disputes among samurai. These courts emphasized precedent in common-sense rulings rather than abstract legal theory. The majority of cases involved land ownership, inheritance, and loyalty disputes. Samurai valued swift, decisive justice that reinforced social order. It was a legal system born from necessity, resolving real conflicts in real time. During this era, the samurai also began to forge their cultural identity. The roots of Bushido, the way of the warrior, took hold. Though the term itself wouldn't become widespread until later centuries, its values were already clear: honor, loyalty, martial skill, and self-control. Blending Confucian ideals, Buddhist endurance, and Shinto devotion, Bushido taught the warrior to embrace duty and scorn death. To die with honor was better than to live in shame. Zen Buddhism, imported from China, gained strong appeal among the warrior elite. Zen's focus on meditation, mental discipline, and direct experience resonated with the samurai ethos. It stripped away complexity, urged focus, and taught clarity in the face of death. It taught a warrior how to act without hesitation, how to strike with calm precision. Thus, as samurai power became the backbone of the state, their spiritual and cultural framework evolved in tandem. The Kamakura period not only institutionalized samurai rule, it gave the warrior class its enduring soul. In the heart of samurai Japan, a quiet revolution was taking place, not on the battlefield, but in the soul. The austere teachings of Zen Buddhism resonated deeply with the warrior class. Its focus on discipline, personal experience, and rejection of elaborate rituals appealed to samurai sensibilities. Zen monks became advisors to powerful officials, and their monasteries served as hubs of continental culture, bringing with them new forms of painting, architecture, literature, and garden design. From this, a distinctive aesthetic emerged: simplicity, restraint, and silent depth. It would come to define samurai culture as much as the sword. Yet Zen was not alone in this spiritual reawakening. Across Japan, new Buddhist movements flourished. Pure Land Buddhism, spread by Honen and his disciple Shinran, offered salvation through faith in Amida Buddha. With its accessible teachings and rituals, it spoke directly to commoners. Meanwhile, Nichiren Buddhism arose as a nationalistic sect centered on the Lotus Sutra, proclaiming Japan's role as the chosen land of Buddhist renewal. These faiths challenged the complex, esoteric Buddhism of the aristocracy. They embraced simplicity, emotion, and personal devotion, values that aligned more closely with the lives of warriors and peasants than with courtly ritual. As the soul of Japan transformed, so too did its warfare. Mounted archery remained the elite martial art of the samurai, demanding years of rigorous training. But combat was evolving. Samurai armor grew more sophisticated, crafted from lacquered leather or metal plates laced with silk cords for strength and flexibility. The once secondary curved sword now rose in importance. Japanese bladesmiths honed their craft, creating swords renowned for their sharpness, balance, and near mystical quality. Combat training became more than physical preparation. It became a spiritual journey. Samurai were taught to accept death calmly, to fight with clarity of mind and purity of purpose. But even the most disciplined warrior could not prepare for what came next. In 1274 and again in 1281, the Mongols came. Under Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire, then the largest in history, launched two invasions of Japan. The first was small by Mongol standards, but still overwhelming. Their fleet landed on Kyushu, only to retreat after a violent storm battered their ships. The second, even more terrifying, brought a combined force of up to 140,000 warriors in two massive fleets. They clashed with Japanese defenders in brutal beach battles. Then once again, nature intervened. A typhoon of immense force scattered and destroyed the Mongol fleet. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind, believing the gods themselves had protected their islands. Though victorious, the Kamakura shogunate faced a hidden cost. These wars brought no spoils. The Mongols left no land behind to distribute as rewards. Samurai who had fought valiantly found themselves impoverished, unrewarded, and burdened with debts. Financially strained, many samurai borrowed heavily from moneylenders, especially wealthy merchants and religious houses. At the same time, the Mongols had introduced new methods of war. Explosive bombs, siege engines, and organized cavalry formations clashed with Japan's traditional one-on-one combat ethos. The samurai would never fight the same way again. Meanwhile, changes in inheritance practices further strained samurai households. Land was divided among multiple sons, shrinking estates and deepening economic pressures. The once temporary position of Jido, local land stewards, became hereditary. Over time, these officials began acting as if the lands they managed were their own. Internal tensions within the warrior class grew. Resentment simmered between wealthy stewards, indebted retainers, and the cultivators of the land. Yet even amid these pressures, the Kamakura era gave rise to a rich cultural legacy. War tales, especially the Heike Monogatari, became a cherished literary form. They celebrated martial valor, but also expressed the Buddhist belief in impermanence, the idea that even the mightiest fall and that all glory fades. Courtly arts did not disappear, but they adapted. Austerity replaced extravagance. Simplicity took the place of ornamentation. Japanese architecture, garden design, and ceramics evolved, shaped by Zen ideals, favoring suggestion over clarity, asymmetry over perfection. It was a cultural world built to reflect a warrior's soul. But beneath the surface of this disciplined, austere society, cracks began to form. Tensions between the imperial court in Kyoto and the Kamakura shogunate in the east were rising. The spiritual, military, and political threads that had held this world together were beginning to fray, setting the stage for a new chapter in Japan's turbulent history. In 1318, Emperor Go-Daigo took the throne with a bold ambition to restore true imperial rule. For over a century, real power had rested in the hands of the Kamakura shogunate, while emperors were reduced to figureheads. Go-Daigo, however, resented these limitations. In secret, he plotted to overthrow the Bakufu and reclaim sovereignty. His early attempts were discovered, and he was exiled. But exile did not end his dream. He escaped, rallied support, and ignited a rebellion. Among his unexpected allies was Ashikaga Takauji, a commander of the Kamakura military who defected from the shogunate. In 1333, imperial forces struck decisively. Nida Yoshisada attacked and destroyed Kamakura, while Go-Daigo's supporters seized Kyoto. The Kamakura shogunate, after nearly 150 years of samurai rule, collapsed. Though the military government had fallen, its structures and customs had already become deeply embedded in Japanese politics. Go-Daigo, now restored, attempted to revive direct imperial rule in what became known as the Kenmu Restoration. But this vision quickly unraveled. The emperor, loyal to the aristocracy, awarded court nobles rather than the warriors who had fought for him. Samurai resentment grew, none more so than Ashikaga Takauji. Feeling betrayed, he rebelled. In 1336, Takauji marched on Kyoto, captured it, and installed a rival emperor from a different imperial branch. Go-Daigo fled south to Yoshino and established a competing court. Thus began the Namboku-cho, or the Northern and Southern Courts period. For nearly 60 years, Japan had two emperors, one in Kyoto, supported by the Ashikaga, and one in Yoshino, claiming rightful succession. This division created confusion, shifting alliances, and ongoing strife. In 1338, Takauji was named shogun, founding the Ashikaga shogunate. Unlike its Kamakura predecessor, which ruled from afar, the Ashikaga Bakufu was based in Kyoto itself, in the Muromachi district. The proximity to the imperial court fostered a unique blend of aristocratic and warrior cultures. But unlike the centralized Kamakura regime, the Ashikaga government was built on compromise. Takauji had secured power by granting autonomy to regional warlords. As a result, he lacked the institutional power to enforce strict control over the provinces. Provincial military governors, Shugo, evolved into Shugo daimyo, powerful lords with private armies and bureaucracies. Though they paid lip service to the shogun, they often acted independently and vied with each other for dominance. Among the Ashikaga rulers, one figure stood above the rest, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun. From 1368 to 1394, Yoshimitsu brought a rare period of cohesion. Using both military pressure and diplomatic skill, he restored order and in 1392 ended the imperial split. The southern court surrendered the imperial regalia, and the imperial line was reunified under the northern branch. Yoshimitsu's reign also marked a cultural renaissance. He re-established official trade with Ming China, resuming exchanges in fine goods, books, and art that had long been suspended. This cultural flow inspired a new wave of continental influence in Japan. Yoshimitsu became a renowned patron of the arts, exemplifying the refined fusion of courtly elegance and samurai authority. His crowning achievement was the construction of Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion. Designed as a retirement villa, it seamlessly blended Japanese and Chinese elements. The lower floor reflected samurai simplicity, while the upper stories, covered in brilliant gold leaf, embodied aristocratic grandeur. In its architecture stood a metaphor for the Muromachi era itself, a society where warriors ruled, but courtly tastes still shaped the soul of the nation. When Ashikaga Yoshimitsu passed away, his magnificent Golden Pavilion villa did not fade into luxury's shadow. Instead, it transformed by his own wishes into a Zen temple. This act symbolized more than personal piety. It captured the rising spiritual and aesthetic influence of Zen Buddhism over samurai culture. The Muromachi period, which Yoshimitsu helped shape, became a golden age not just of power but of art. It was a time when the elegance of court tradition, the introspection of Zen, and the discipline of the warrior fused into uniquely Japanese expressions of beauty. One of the most enduring forms to emerge was ink landscape painting. Though imported from China, it took on distinct Japanese life under masters like Sesshu Toyo. His brush captured not just the natural world, but the spirit behind it, evoking mood, stillness, and spiritual insight in every stroke. Simultaneously, garden design reached unprecedented heights. The dry landscape gardens, carefully arranged rocks, raked gravel, and spare vegetation, were not meant to mimic nature directly, but to suggest it, inviting contemplation. These gardens became physical meditations, quiet spaces that reflected the warrior's need for mental discipline and clarity. On stage, another art form blossomed. No theater, crafted by Kanami and refined by his son Zeami under Yoshimitsu's patronage, distilled the human experience into movement, music, poetry, and silence. With its masked actors, supernatural themes, and sparse sets, No told stories of lingering spirits, forgotten regrets, and transformation. Its stylized form and poetic subtlety resonated deeply with samurai values, restraint, discipline, and grace under tension. Meanwhile, the tea ceremony, once an informal custom, became a codified ritual of immense cultural weight. Guided by Zen ideals, the ceremony embraced the wabi aesthetic, beauty found in austerity, imperfection, and quiet. Masters like Murata Juko and later Takeno Ju laid the spiritual groundwork for what would reach perfection under Senno Rikyu. For samurai, the tea ceremony became more than a social occasion. It was an exercise in focus, humility, and inner calm. Yet, while culture flourished, politics frayed. The later Muromachi period was marked by increasing instability. In 1467, the Onin War erupted over a succession dispute within the Ashikaga house. What began as a court intrigue in Kyoto spiraled into an 11-year nightmare. By the time peace returned in 1477, the capital lay in ruins, and central authority was in tatters. Japan had entered the Sengoku, or Warring States, period. The Onin War exposed the deepening weakness of the shogunate. Regional lords, the Shugo daimyo, had grown largely autonomous. They commanded private armies, levied taxes, and often ignored orders from Kyoto. In the chaos, power slipped further downward. Ambitious lower-ranking samurai seized their moment, rising up to overthrow their superiors. From this upheaval emerged a new class of warlords, the Sengoku daimyo. Unlike earlier aristocrats, these men did not inherit power. They seized it. Their authority came not from court appointment, but from battlefield dominance. Yet even as Japan splintered into rival fiefdoms, samurai culture deepened. The aesthetic ideal of Yugen, a subtle, mysterious grace, blossomed. It infused poetry, painting, and landscape with a sense of hidden depth. Suggestion was favored over statement, rough beauty over polished perfection. These values mirrored Zen philosophy and samurai practicality, clarity without ostentation, form-serving function, elegance and restraint. The role of the samurai also evolved. The ideal warrior was no longer just a master of weapons. He was expected to embody Bunbu Ryodo, the dual path of literary and martial arts. A true samurai needed administrative skill, cultural refinement, and spiritual maturity in addition to combat prowess. This broadening identity created new social divisions within the warrior class. High-ranking samurai began to distinguish themselves from lower-foot soldiers and mounted retainers. Social stratification hardened. Religion, too, mirrored this fractured world. Zen Buddhism remained a spiritual anchor for the warrior elite, promoting discipline and detachment. At the same time, Pure Land Buddhism continued to offer hope and salvation to the common people through its promise of rebirth in Amida Buddha's paradise. In a world torn by war, both elite and ordinary Japanese sought solace in faith. The Muromachi era, then, was a paradox, a time of immense beauty and profound destruction, a period where art soared and governments collapsed. In the ashes of Kyoto, amidst ink-stained scrolls and raked gravel gardens, the samurai world found its most enduring voice, one shaped by silence, sword, and soul. During Japan's twilight of centralized power, religious movements began to reshape society in unexpected ways. True Pure Land Buddhism, founded by Shinran, wasn't just a spiritual force. It built temples, shaped doctrine, and even wielded military strength. Meanwhile, Nichiren's Lotus sect inspired fierce loyalty among both samurai and commoners, sometimes inciting uprisings with its nationalistic and apocalyptic prophecies. As these forces stirred from below, the Ashikaga shogunate withered from above. By the end of the Muromachi period, the Ashikaga shoguns were mere figureheads, their authority little more than a shadow under the control of whoever dominated Kyoto. In 1573, that final thread snapped. The warlord Oda Nobunaga expelled the last shogun, Yoshiaki, from Kyoto. Though Yoshiaki stubbornly held on to the title until his death, the Ashikaga era was effectively over. Japan had plunged headfirst into the Sengoku period, a time of relentless warfare that would test the samurai to their core. With no shogun to rally around and the emperor reduced to ceremony, power was no longer granted by lineage or courtly approval. It came from the sword. In this chaotic landscape, regional warlords known as daimyo emerged as the real power brokers. They built strongholds, raised armies, and governed territories like independent kings. Many weren't born into power. They seized it. Skilled generals overthrew their lords, and the old hierarchy gave way to a ruthless meritocracy. A common saying from the time summed it up perfectly: the lowly can be raised up, the mighty can be brought down. Warfare itself transformed. The image of the lone samurai duelist faded as armies swelled in size. Foot soldiers, ashigaru, drawn from the peasantry, formed the backbone of military campaigns. Equipped with spears, bows, and eventually firearms, these commoners fought in coordinated ranks, not as individuals. Samurai became officers, strategists, and symbols of discipline rather than merely elite swordsmen. Then, in 1543, an accident of fate changed everything. Portuguese traders shipwrecked on the island of Tanegashima introduced firearms to Japan. The matchlock arquebus, quickly dubbed Tanegashima, was unlike anything the samurai had known. Traditionalists scoffed at first, but warlords like Oda Nobunaga saw its potential. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga's 3,000 gunners unleashed rotating volleys, tearing through the cavalry of the famed Takeda clan. It was a stunning display of how technology could redefine the battlefield. As warfare grew more complex, so too did its infrastructure. Daimyo constructed castles, no longer simple hilltop forts, but towering stone citadels with moats, angled walls, and command towers. These castles served as both fortresses and administrative hubs, symbols of both power and culture. Behind the front lines, logistics became an art. Feeding armies, moving supplies, gathering intelligence. All had to be mastered. Siege tactics improved. Field fortifications became standard. Cavalry, infantry, archers, and gunners were woven into one synchronized fighting machine. Even military knowledge was systematized. Written manuals spread, preserving hard-won lessons of blood and fire. The Sengoku period was brutal, but in its chaos, Japan found the forge from which a new order would one day be born. Amid the chaos and carnage of Japan's Sengoku period, legends were forged on the battlefield. Tada Shingan and Wasugi Kenshin, locked in a rivalry that spanned 5 intense battles at Kawanakajima, became immortalized not just for their courage, but for their sheer brilliance as military tacticians. Their clash was more than a contest of armies. It was a duel of minds. Elsewhere, Date Masamune, the fearsome one-eyed dragon of the north, overcame childhood illness and political danger to build a formidable domain through sharp diplomacy and unrelenting strength. In the West, Mori Motonari mastered the art of alliance building and defensive warfare, proving that brains could often outweigh brute force. These were not just warriors, they were architects of regional power. But life for the samurai during this period was anything but predictable. For every hero who rose through valor and cunning, another fell into obscurity after a single crushing defeat. This harsh world carved deep values into the soul of the warrior class. Loyalty that endured betrayal, courage that defied death, and a fatalistic grace captured in the haunting phrase, "Life and death are but a feather's weight." This wasn't just poetry. It was a code for surviving a world without guarantees. And yet, even amid relentless war, Japan's cultural heart beat on. The daimyo, eager to show refinement and legitimize their rule, became patrons of the arts. Zen Buddhism shaped their worldview. The tea ceremony, landscape gardens, and calligraphy became subtle yet powerful displays of authority. The aesthetic of wabi-sabi, beauty found in imperfection and impermanence, flourished, a quiet answer to the violence around them. In this spirit, the tea master Senno Rikyu refined the tea ceremony into a ritual of deep spiritual and emotional resonance. Under the patronage of warlords like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the tea room became more than a place for drink. It was a sanctuary, a sacred pause where warriors touched the eternal amidst the fleeting. At the same time, economic life surged forward in unexpected ways. Castle towns bustled with commerce. New trade routes flourished, and agricultural advances pushed productivity higher. In this strange paradox, war became a catalyst for growth. Ambitious daimyo saw the value of wealth and invested in markets, roads, and production. Trade extended beyond Japan's shores, linking it with China, Korea, and even European powers. But power wasn't just in the hands of the sword wielders. Religious institutions had long held land, money, and military strength. Monasteries like the Honganji, home of the true Pure Land sect, commanded massive followings. These weren't just pilgrims. They were armed devotees, the Ikoiki, ready to rise against any lord who threatened their way of life. Other militant sects like the Hokaiki joined the fray, sometimes siding with desperate peasants to resist the samurai elite. Japan's battlefield was no longer just one of daimyo and warriors. It was a patchwork of faith, fear, and fire. And what of the ordinary people, the farmers, merchants, and villagers caught in the middle? Their resilience was remarkable. Villages formed their own councils, negotiated with the daimyo for protection, and even played rival lords against each other. Taxes were crushing, battles constant, and homes were often destroyed. But still, life endured. In growing urban centers, new ways of living emerged beyond the samurai's shadow. And in this swirl of change, women of the samurai class took on roles no less vital or heroic than the men. They ran households, managed alliances, and kept family honor alive. Some stepped into the chaos themselves. Lady Hosokawa Gracia, a Christian convert, chose death over capture, becoming a symbol of devotion and sacrifice. Lady Ai of Hikone led the defense of her home after her husband's death. And Lady Yodo, once the concubine of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, became a key player in the political drama after his death, guiding armies, negotiating power, and defending Osaka Castle against the rising Tokugawa. These women weren't background figures. They were pillars of resistance, agency, and strength in a world shaped by war. In every corner of this turbulent era, from the blood-soaked fields of Kawanakajima to the serene tea rooms of Kyoto, Sengoku Japan was a land of contrasts, where destruction birthed creation, and the human spirit endured through both blade and brush. By the mid-16th century, the chaos of Japan's Warring States period, where hundreds of daimyo battled for dominance, began to show signs of resolution. Amidst the constant warfare, three extraordinary leaders would rise in succession to reunify the fractured nation. Together, they would transform Japan from a patchwork of warring provinces into a centralized feudal state of unmatched stability and cultural brilliance. First came Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless innovator. Then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the peasant-born general of genius. And finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient architect of lasting peace. These three men, often called the Great Unifiers, built upon one another's achievements to reshape Japan forever. Oda Nobunaga, born in 1534 in Owari Province, started from humble beginnings. He controlled only a portion of his province, and his eccentric behavior earned him the mocking title the Fool of Owari. But behind the flamboyant exterior was a brilliant strategist. After crushing rival branches of his own family, Nobunaga expanded his territory through relentless military campaigns, cunning diplomacy, and groundbreaking reforms. His greatest legacy was his willingness to break with tradition. Nobunaga embraced firearms at a time when many samurai still clung to the sword. He organized arquebus squads to fire in synchronized volleys, an innovation that proved devastating at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. There, his gunners shredded the feared Takeda cavalry, proving that disciplined firepower could defeat even the most elite mounted warriors. Nobunaga also transformed the way armies were structured. He favored coordinated infantry formations over the chaotic heroism of individual samurai and developed logistical networks that allowed for sustained campaigns across long distances. Yet Nobunaga was more than a general. He was a reformer. He launched sweeping land surveys to systematize taxation and clarify ownership. To stimulate commerce, he abolished internal tolls and monopolistic guilds, introducing his famous Rakuichi Rakuza policy, free markets that allowed towns and cities to flourish. His economic reforms strengthened his war machine and sowed the seeds for Japan's future prosperity. But Nobunaga was merciless in his pursuit of centralized power. Religious institutions that threatened his authority were crushed without hesitation. In 1571, he ordered the total destruction of the militant Buddhist monastery on Mount Hiei, killing thousands and burning it to the ground. The true Pure Land sect's fortress at Ishiyama Honganji endured a decade-long siege before finally falling. Nobunaga's campaigns against these powerful temples shocked the nation, But they broke the back of Buddhist political influence and cleared the path for secular control. By 1582, Nobunaga had unified central Japan and stood on the brink of completing his grand project. But his meteoric rise came to a sudden, dramatic end. On June 21st, while resting at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, he was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded and without hope of escape, Nobunaga set the temple ablaze and took his own life. The flames of Honnoji consumed his body, but not his legacy. Into the power vacuum stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's most brilliant general. Hideyoshi's life story is one of history's most astonishing ascents. Born in 1537 to a peasant farmer, he began his career humbly, as a sandal-bearer in Nobunaga's service. But through unmatched talent, cunning, and tireless ambition, he climbed the ranks. Nobunaga had recognized his brilliance and entrusted him with increasing responsibility. Now, with Nobunaga gone, Hideyoshi seized the moment. Within weeks, he avenged his master's death by defeating Akechi Mitsuhide and asserting leadership over Nobunaga's coalition. From a peasant's son to Japan's new ruler, Hideyoshi's journey had just begun. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rise is one of the most remarkable in all of Japanese history. Born a peasant with no samurai blood, he could never become shogun. But he didn't need to. Hideyoshi compensated with unmatched political savvy, sharp psychological instincts, and sheer military genius. When his lord, Oda Nobunaga, was assassinated in 1582, Hideyoshi acted swiftly. He crushed Akechi Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki and claimed Nobunaga's mantle. Over the next decade, he pursued the unification of Japan with relentless focus. Military campaigns against the Mori in the west, the Shimazu in the south, and finally the powerful Hojo at Odawara in 1590. With that final victory, he did what generations of warriors had failed to do: unite all of Japan under a single authority. But Hideyoshi was still a man of common birth, and so he couldn't claim the title of shogun. Instead, he climbed through the imperial court ranks, eventually becoming Kampaku, imperial regent. He married his sister into the royal family, adopted the noble surname Toyotomi, and used the emperor as a source of legitimacy while holding all real power himself. His rule was not just military, it was transformative. Determined to prevent any return to the chaos of the Sengoku period, Hideyoshi issued bold reforms. The sword hunt of 1508 disarmed the peasantry under the pretense of building a giant Buddha. But its real purpose was social control, ensuring that only samurai bore arms. His land surveys clarified ownership, standardized taxation, and mapped the empire's productive capacity. But perhaps his most enduring policy was the strict enforcement of social hierarchy. Farmers were bound to their land. Merchants couldn't become warriors. Samurai could no longer trade or farm. It was a frozen system designed for order, but ironically, it was a system that would have barred Hideyoshi himself from ever rising to power. Despite his humble background, Hideyoshi embraced culture with imperial flair. He built Osaka Castle, an architectural marvel, and elevated the tea ceremony to new heights under the guidance of the master Sen no Rikyu. Yet the relationship soured. Hideyoshi's love for opulence, exemplified by his golden tea room, clashed with Rikyu's philosophy of simplicity. Eventually, Hideyoshi ordered the tea master's suicide, a chilling reflection of the contradictions in his rule. But Hideyoshi's ambition didn't stop at Japan's shores. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion of Korea, dreaming of conquering China. Japanese forces saw early success, but fierce Korean resistance and Chinese intervention stalled their advance. A second invasion in 1597 achieved little, and when Hideyoshi died in 1598, his dream collapsed. The invasions drained Japan's treasury and left lasting scars in Korean memory. But they also brought back Korean artisans whose pottery would influence Japanese ceramics for centuries. Aware of his mortality, Hideyoshi tried to secure his legacy. He formed a council of 5 elders to rule on behalf of his young son, Hideyori. Among them was Tokugawa Ieyasu, a quiet but formidable daimyo. Hideyoshi had once forced him into submission, but after Hideyoshi's death, the careful balance of power unraveled. Ieyasu, patient and calculating, would soon seize the moment. From the ashes of Hideyoshi's grand project, he would rise to become Japan's final unifier and lay the foundations for 250 years of Tokugawa rule. As the legacy of Toyotomi Hideyoshi began to fade, a new power struggle emerged from the vacuum he left behind. The Council of Five Elders, established to safeguard his heir, Hideyori, fractured into rival factions. Among them, one man slowly and patiently maneuvered into position, Tokugawa Ieyasu. By the year 1600, Japan stood divided once more. Two great alliances had formed: the Eastern Army, loyal to Tokugawa, and the Western Army, determined to resist his domination and defend Hideyori's claim. The confrontation would come at Sekigahara, a small village that would soon host the largest and most decisive battle in Japanese history. On October 21st, 1600, the fate of Japan was sealed. Ieyasu's army, prepared and strategically positioned, met the Western coalition in a clash of thousands. Crucially, during the heat of battle, key commanders from the Western side defected to Tokugawa's ranks, turning the tide. The Eastern Army triumphed. The Battle of Sekigahara was not just a military victory, it was the birth of a new political order. Tokugawa Ieyasu became the undisputed leader of Japan. With sweeping authority, he redistributed lands, rewarding loyal allies and stripping his enemies of power. In doing so, he fundamentally reshaped the feudal structure to cement Tokugawa dominance. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor named Ieyasu shogun, reviving a title that had been vacant since the fall of the Ashikaga. But in a masterstroke of political stability, Ieyasu retired just 2 years later, transferring the title to his son Hidetada while continuing to govern from behind the scenes. This act created a tradition of retired shoguns maintaining real power, adding another layer of continuity and control. The final obstacle to Tokugawa's supremacy was Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, still alive and protected within the formidable Osaka castle. In 1615, Ieyasu led a campaign to crush this lingering threat. After a brutal siege, Osaka Castle fell. Hideyori perished. With that, the Toyotomi lineage ended, and Japan's long age of civil war was truly over. The three unifiers, Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Ieyasu, had reshaped Japan forever. Nobunaga shattered the old guard through military innovation and sheer will. Hideyoshi unified the land and introduced sweeping social reforms. And Ieyasu consolidated it all into a durable system that would last over 2 centuries. Tokugawa Ieyasu moved Japan's political center to Edo, modern-day Tokyo, signifying a new beginning. The Tokugawa shogunate built the most stable, long-lasting government in Japanese history. Its system of governance, known as the Bakuhan system, balanced centralized authority with local autonomy. The Tokugawa shogun directly controlled about 1/4 of Japan's agricultural land, strategically located around cities, ports, and major travel routes. The remaining lands were divided among roughly 260 domains, each ruled by a daimyo who governed his territory independently but remained subordinate to the shogunate. To maintain control over these powerful lords, the Tokugawa devised a complex web of classifications and obligations. Daimyo were sorted into 3 ranks: the Shinpan, relatives of the Tokugawa and trusted allies; the Fudai, longtime supporters who held key positions in government; and the Tozama, or outside lords, who had submitted only after Sekigahara and were viewed with suspicion. The most ingenious mechanism of control was the Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance system, implemented fully by 1635. Under this policy, every daimyo was required to maintain 2 residences, one in their home domain, the other in Edo. They had to alternate living between the two, spending every other year in the capital. When they returned to their provinces, their wives and heirs were left behind in Edo as hostages to ensure continued loyalty. This system achieved multiple goals. It drained the daimyo's resources through travel and the upkeep of 2 households, prevented rebellion by keeping them under surveillance, and exposed them to Edo's refined culture, fostering national cohesion. It also created a constant flow of elites from the provinces to the capital, knitting the country together with shared values and administrative norms. Through these reforms, Tokugawa Ieyasu didn't just win a war, he built a new nation. The Tokugawa period had begun. In the early 17th century, as the Tokugawa shogunate solidified its grip on Japan, it looked outward and saw danger. Memories of European firearms that had once changed the face of war during the Sengoku period were still fresh. Even more alarming was the growing shadow of European imperialism across Asia. To the Tokugawa rulers, foreign influence wasn't just exotic, it was potentially destabilizing. Between 1633 and 1639, they issued a series of sweeping edicts designed to isolate Japan from the outside world. Japanese citizens were forbidden from traveling abroad or returning from overseas. Christianity was banned outright, seen as a subversive ideology threatening to undermine shogunal authority. European missionaries were expelled. Foreign trade was limited to a single narrow portal, the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, where only the Dutch were permitted to trade under strict supervision. Chinese merchants also had access, and Korean envoys were allowed occasional contact. But that was it. This was Sakoku, the so-called closed country policy. Yet it wasn't total isolation. Ideas and information still trickled in, just enough to keep Japan connected, but insulated. While the outside world changed rapidly, the Tokugawa focused on building a tightly controlled society at home. At the heart of their vision was a rigid social hierarchy rooted in Neo-Confucian ideals. At the top stood the samurai, only about 6% of the population, honored not for their wealth, but for their duty. Below them were the farmers, seen as noble producers of the nation's food. Next came the artisans, creators of tools and goods. At the bottom were the merchants, paradoxically often the richest, yet scorned as profit-driven and unproductive. Beyond this official ladder were the outcast classes, the aitae, who handled tasks considered spiritually impure like leather tanning and animal disposal, and the hainin, a group including entertainers, beggars, and prostitutes. These roles weren't just social, they were legally enforced and culturally reinforced, forming the bones of Tokugawa order. But this harmony came with complexity, especially for the samurai. No longer warriors of constant conflict, they became scholars, bureaucrats, and city officials. This drastic shift caused a profound identity crisis. What did it mean to be samurai in an era of peace? The answer emerged in the form of the literate warrior, a figure skilled not only in martial arts, but also in calligraphy, poetry, and Confucian classics. The sword remained a symbol, but combat gave way to ritual. Swordsmanship evolved into kendo, more a spiritual and mental discipline than a battlefield necessity. Economically, the samurai also changed. Most lived in castle towns, no longer holding land but serving their daimyo masters for a fixed rice stipend. These stipends were often insufficient, especially in a world of rising urban luxuries. Many samurai fell into debt, ironically to merchants, the very class they officially outranked. It was a paradox, the noble warrior class increasingly reliant on those deemed least honorable. Meanwhile, the towns themselves flourished. Castle towns were meticulously planned. The daimyo's castle at the center, surrounded by rings of samurai homes, and on the outskirts, artisan and merchant quarters. Cities like Edo exploded in size, with Edo alone surpassing 1 million residents by 1700, making it the world's largest city at the time. Urban life brought with it the need for governance. Water systems, fire prevention, and municipal administration grew in complexity. Despite the official disdain for urban commerce, the concentration of samurai in cities fueled a thriving market for goods, services, and entertainment. Outside the urban centers, rural Japan remained the shogunate's foundation. Villages operated under tight samurai oversight and were collectively responsible for maintaining order, obeying laws, and most importantly, paying taxes. The rice tax, typically between 40 and 60% of the harvest, flowed up the chain from the farmers, through the village headmen, usually affluent peasants, to the daimyo treasuries, sustaining the elaborate administrative and samurai apparatus. In this way, the Tokugawa shogunate created a self-contained, finely tuned machine, insulated from foreign disruption, rigidly stratified at home, and meticulously organized down to the village level. It was a society built for stability, but one that carried the seeds of future transformation. During the early Edo period, Japan experienced a dramatic transformation that went far beyond mere political unification. On the agricultural front, farmers across the country turned once unusable lands into fertile plots through land reclamation, irrigation improvements, and clever use of new tools and techniques. The introduction of fertilization methods and more intensive cultivation practices led to greater yields. Rice was no longer the only dominant crop. Farmers began growing cotton, indigo, sugar, and tobacco, integrating double cropping into their yearly schedules. These surpluses didn't just fill granaries. They fueled something much bigger: population growth, bustling towns, rising handicraft industries, and growing trade networks. Ironically, while Tokugawa policies tried to lock society into a static feudal mold, these very agricultural advances laid the groundwork for a far more dynamic economy. But how did the shogunate keep such a diverse and changing society in line? The answer lies in ideology, specifically Neo-Confucianism. The Tokugawa borrowed from the Chinese Jusui school, which emphasized strict hierarchy, moral duty, and fulfilling one's role in society. It was the perfect philosophy to justify samurai rule. According to this worldview, harmony in society came only when everyone acted with sincerity and dedication, knowing their place and performing their role. Samurai, no longer needed for constant warfare, were educated as moral administrators. Institutions like the Shoheiko in Edo became elite training grounds for the Bakufu's retainers, while local domains established their own samurai schools, infusing Confucian teachings with local political aims. Religion, too, came under Tokugawa control. Once autonomous and politically active, Buddhist institutions were now drawn into the bureaucratic web. The Danka system required every household to affiliate with a Buddhist temple, officially to root out Christianity, but unofficially, it created a powerful administrative network. Temples became the state's tools, documenting births, deaths, and marriages. While this control stifled doctrinal innovation, temples remained vital cultural repositories, preserving ancient manuscripts, rituals, and artistic traditions that would influence Japan for generations. At the same time, Japan began to look inward, not just politically but spiritually. A revival of native Shinto traditions emerged, led by thinkers like Yamaga Soko and Motoori Norinaga. They pored over ancient Japanese texts, seeking an identity untouched by Buddhism or Chinese philosophy. Their work started as scholarship, but it quietly sowed seeds of resistance to Tokugawa orthodoxy. In time, this nativist movement would challenge the very foundations of the regime's intellectual legitimacy. Meanwhile, in the growing cities, culture flourished. The peace and prosperity of Tokugawa rule created a demand for art and entertainment. Licensed pleasure quarters, like the famous Yoshiwara in Edo, became epicenters of vibrant artistic life. Kabuki theater, once a raucous street performance, matured into a sophisticated dramatic form with professional actors, specialized theaters, and enormous popular followings. Alongside it, Bunraku puppet theater blossomed, with complex mechanical puppets, moving musical scores, and emotionally rich scripts. At the heart of many Bunraku dramas were the moral dilemmas of Edo society, stories where personal feelings clashed with rigid social obligations. Playwrights like Chikamatsu Monzaemon captured this tension with heartbreaking precision. By the mid-17th century, the Tokugawa regime had created one of the most stable governments in Japanese history. The horrors of the Sengoku Civil Wars became distant memories. Entire generations grew up never knowing conflict, only the Pax Tokugawa. The samurai class, once defined by martial skill, redefined itself as a class of scholars, bureaucrats, and cultural leaders. Japan had closed itself off from the outside world, but inside, a vibrant, complex society continued to evolve. The code that guided these new samurai lives was Bushido, the way of the warrior. Interestingly, it didn't reach its most refined form during wartime, but in this long stretch of peace. Bushido emphasized loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, moral discipline, and a readiness to die rather than live in shame. Drawing on Confucian ethics, Zen introspection, and native warrior traditions, Bushido gave the samurai a reason to exist in a world that no longer needed their swords. It turned warriors into moral examples, men expected to embody the ideal of a harmonious society. Yet, for all its emphasis on loyalty and discipline, life for a samurai in this period varied dramatically. For the wealthy elite, it meant scholarship and influence. For the lower-ranking retainers, it could mean quiet poverty and stifling routine, bound by duty but lacking glory. Life as a samurai during the Edo period was far more structured and layered than the romanticized images of lone swordsmen roaming the countryside. In truth, the samurai class was highly stratified. At the top were senior administrators, high-ranking samurai who lived in spacious residences, surrounded by servants and wielding real influence as advisors to their domain lords. Below them were the middle-ranking samurai, men with specialized bureaucratic roles that demanded education and administrative skill. And at the base, forming the bulk of the warrior class, were low-ranking samurai. These men lived not much better than commoners. They worked as clerks, gatekeepers, and minor officials, always under pressure to maintain the dignity of the samurai name despite limited means. Where a samurai lived was a visual cue to his social status. In the well-planned castle towns, homes were arranged hierarchically. Those closer to the daimyo's castle belonged to higher-ranking retainers. Each residence had a roofed gate leading to a reception space where lower-status visitors could wait or speak with household members without being invited inside. Interiors were simple but elegant, divided by paper sliding doors and lined with tatami mats. The aesthetic was one of disciplined restraint, a hanging scroll with calligraphy, a minimalist flower arrangement in the tokonoma, and perhaps a carefully maintained garden, no matter how small, that echoed the samurai ideal of finding serenity in nature shaped by human order. Education was central to a samurai's identity. Boys began learning at age 6 or 7, often in schools sponsored by their domains. The curriculum was split along twin paths, literary and martial, reading Chinese classics, practicing calligraphy, and studying history and arithmetic prepared them for governance. Martial training, on the other hand, honed their combat readiness through swordsmanship, archery, spearwork, horseback riding, and tactical thinking. Yet this wasn't just about fighting. It was about shaping character. Martial arts schools like the Yagyu Shinkajiru didn't merely teach technique. They imparted a philosophy of decisive action, calm under pressure, and inner balance. Weapons and armor also took on symbolic importance. The katana, more than a tool of war, was seen as the very soul of the samurai. Crafted with a blend of metallurgy and ritual by master swordsmiths, legends like Miyamoto Musashi among them, these blades embodied honor and discipline. By the Edo period, full suits of armor had become ceremonial, grand, and decorative, with elaborately crested helmets that identified warriors more by family than function. The right to carry two swords, the long katana and shorter wakizashi, was a visible badge of samurai status, separating them from the common crowd. A samurai's daily life, especially for the middle ranks, followed a disciplined rhythm. The day began early with ablutions and a visit to the family shrine or Buddhist altar, reinforcing spiritual grounding. After a modest breakfast, often just rice with vegetables or fish, he would walk to his post at the castle or government office. There, his tasks could range from writing reports to collecting taxes, settling disputes, or inspecting local infrastructure. Evenings were far from idle. Many samurai used that time to improve themselves, reading Confucian texts, practicing martial arts, writing poetry, or playing musical instruments. Cultural cultivation was as important as administrative function. Social interaction among samurai was governed by an intricate etiquette system. Everything, from how one entered a room, to the depth of a bow, to the topics of polite conversation, was determined by status. These practices weren't just about manners. They reflected the Confucian belief that external form shapes inner virtue. Even casual meetings had ritualized elements that signaled mutual recognition of rank. Children were drilled in these behaviors from an early age, ensuring the perpetuation of order and decorum. Marriage, too, was more institutional than emotional. Samurai unions were often arranged by family heads or domain authorities to serve political or financial goals. Love was rarely the priority. The bride brought a dowry, furniture, clothing, sometimes cash, while the groom's family provided housing. The wife's role was clearly defined. She managed the household, oversaw servants, educated young children, kept financial records, and above all was expected to produce heirs. Within the carefully layered world of Edo society, everyone had their role. And for samurai, duty always came before desire. Although samurai marriages often began as practical arrangements, tools for alliance building or securing family prestige, many of these unions grew into relationships marked by genuine emotional depth. Life in a samurai household wasn't just about the couple or the immediate family. It was a multi-generational tapestry. Fathers passed leadership to their eldest sons, while younger brothers either branched off or remained in supporting roles. And when no suitable heir was born, adoption was a widespread solution to ensure the family name endured. The household might also include trusted retainers, servants, even individuals not connected by blood, all united by loyalty and duty. These families preserved their histories in graves, ancestral tablets, and meticulous records, which served as daily reminders of the weighty obligation each member bore to protect the family's honor and legacy. But samurai life wasn't all discipline and duty. In fact, their cultural world was rich and vibrant. They wrote poetry in elegant gatherings, not unlike salons, where participants composed verses on shared themes. They painted, practiced calligraphy, arranged flowers, not as idle hobbies, but as expressions of beauty governed by restraint and discipline. The tea ceremony, far more than sipping tea, was a ritual crafted from Zen principles: simplicity, imperfection, quietude. Sitting in silence, contemplating the transient nature of life, the samurai could find the clarity amid the chaos of responsibility. Music, too, played a role. Instruments like the shakuhachi flute or shamisen weren't just for entertainment. They were symbols of cultural refinement. Yet even in times of peace, the samurai never lost sight of their martial roots. Physical activities remained essential, blending combat readiness with community. Archery competitions once began as religious rites, but evolved into precise demonstrations of focus and technique. Sumo wrestling, with its elaborate rituals, grew from battlefield grappling into a sport that symbolized strength and discipline. Hunting, regulated by the shogunate, wasn't just leisure. It honed horsemanship and weapon skills. These were more than pastimes. They were stages where bonds were forged and warrior identity reinforced. At the core of samurai life was a spiritual mosaic. Confucianism offered ethical guidance for daily conduct. Buddhism, especially Zen, taught detachment and acceptance of impermanence, essential for those who might face death at any moment. Shinto practices honored ancestors and nature's forces. Many samurai kept household shrines, seamlessly blending Buddhist meditation with Shinto offerings, participating in festivals aligned with the ritual calendar. Religion wasn't separate from duty. It was deeply embedded in daily rhythms and moral frameworks. Zen Buddhism, in particular, shaped not only their beliefs but their aesthetics, favoring simplicity, subtlety, and awareness. This influenced everything from garden design to food presentation. The arts it inspired, ink painting, haiku poetry, and tea ceremony, all served to sharpen mental stillness. For a samurai, that inner clarity wasn't just spiritual, it could be the difference between life and death in combat. Speaking of death, the samurai embraced it with a unique intensity. The phrase, "the way of the samurai is found in death," wasn't metaphorical. Warriors were expected to live with constant awareness of mortality, ready to meet death with dignity. Seppuku, ritual suicide, became the ultimate expression of resolve. What began as a battlefield necessity evolved into a highly formalized ritual. Whether it was to avoid dishonor, protest injustice, or atone for failure, seppuku turned an inevitable end into a final act of self-mastery. Yet as time moved forward, especially during the peaceful Edo period, a rift appeared between the romanticized samurai of old and the bureaucratic realities of the present. Theaters and novels began to glorify the warriors of the past, those who lived and died by the sword, who faced clear moral crossroads. In contrast, real-life samurai administrators navigated gray zones of ethics and compromise. This nostalgia painted a powerful picture for generations to come, both in Japan and abroad. But the truth was more complex. The samurai legacy was built on contradiction, self-sacrifice and self-interest, beauty and brutality, philosophical depth and rigid hierarchy. And it's precisely this tension that makes their story so compelling. During the Edo period, something remarkable happened. Despite a society defined by rigid class lines, the ideals of the samurai, those elite warrior administrators, began to seep into every corner of Japanese life. Wealthy merchants, though forbidden from wearing swords or claiming samurai status, eagerly adopted the aesthetics, education, and even ethical values of the warrior class. Farmers, too, absorbed the moral essence of Bushido into village codes of conduct. Even those on the fringes of society, outcast groups excluded from mainstream life, began to build their own honor systems, echoing samurai discipline and loyalty. The result? A deeply Japanese civilization uniquely layered. Samurai ideals permeated the social fabric, while the outward trappings of feudal order remained intact. Though numerically few, the samurai had become cultural titans. But what of the women within this elite class? Their lives reveal a delicate balance between privilege and restriction. On one hand, they were part of Japan's ruling tier. On the other, they lived under strict codes that demanded obedience, modesty, and self-sacrifice. Their daily realities varied dramatically, shaped by household rank, family wealth, and personal circumstances. And yet, samurai women shared one thing: responsibility. Education for samurai daughters was surprisingly robust, especially when compared to most parts of the world at the time. These girls studied classical literature, calligraphy, and poetry. They learned music in the tea ceremony. They practiced the art of conversation and social grace. But they didn't just prepare for tea gatherings. They also learned how to manage an entire household: budgets, servants' schedules, rituals. The aim wasn't simply to entertain. It was to produce cultured, capable women who could manage affairs while preserving the family's honor and reputation. While men were trained for battle and bureaucracy, women were being sculpted into symbols of grace, intellect, and authority within the private sphere. At the heart of this education lay Confucian values. A widely read text, the Onna Daigaku, or Greater Learning for Women, laid down the code. Absolute loyalty to the husband's household, self-restraint, humility, and constant awareness of duty. These weren't just abstract virtues. For a samurai woman, failure to live by these ideals brought shame not only on herself but on her entire lineage. And so, marriages weren't love stories. They were contracts, strategic alliances negotiated by family elders to forge political or economic advantage. A girl might marry in her teens, paired with an older man from a family of equal or greater rank. Upon marriage, she left her birth family, physically and legally, and pledged her loyalty to her husband's household. These marriages were far less flexible than those of the commoner class, where mutual consent and even divorce were possible. But marriage wasn't the end of her role, it was just the beginning. The samurai wife became the backbone of the household. She managed daily operations, oversaw servants, recorded finances, directed rituals, and upheld decorum. During her husband's absences, often prolonged due to the Sankin Kotai system that required daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, she effectively ran the estate. This wasn't a ceremonial position. It required real intelligence, discretion, and leadership. Her greatest responsibility, however, lay in producing a male heir. The continuation of the family name and its rights to land, income, and status depended on her ability to give birth to a son. Failure to do so could mean the arrival of a concubine or the adoption of an outside heir, marginalizing the wife's influence. But success, bearing a son, brought not only security but authority. She would guide his early years, instilling the values of discipline, honor, and culture that define the samurai. Through him, her legacy continued. And so, the samurai woman lived a life of profound paradox, bound by duty, yet essential to power. Publicly silent, yet privately central to the functioning of samurai society. In her hands, the household thrived. Through her teaching, the next generation of warriors emerged. And with every quiet act of stewardship, she helped shape the soul of a civilization. Imagine being born into a world where your destiny was shaped before you could even speak. For boys of the samurai class, life began under the watchful care of their mothers, until the age of 7, that is. Then it was time for the sword. Formal martial training and academic instruction would commence under strict male tutors. But for daughters, the journey remained firmly in the hands of their mothers, lasting right up until marriage. These young girls learned not only how to manage a household, but also how to embody the grace, intelligence, and strength expected of a samurai wife. Their mothers weren't just caretakers. They were culture bearers, educators, and moral compasses, shaping the values of the warrior class. Yet samurai women were not confined to the shadows. In moments of war and chaos, some stepped into the fray. The legendary Tomoe Gozen is perhaps the most striking example, a fierce warrior who fought valiantly during the Genpei War, wielding the naginata with astonishing skill. This polearm, originally a battlefield weapon, eventually became a symbol of refined martial discipline for samurai daughters. During the Sengoku period's relentless sieges, some women fought side by side with their husbands and sons, defending castles with unflinching courage. Over time, naginata training evolved into a rite of passage, a unique blend of physical strength and moral cultivation that reinforced a warrior woman's identity. But it wasn't all swords and strategy. The cultural contributions of samurai women echoed throughout Japanese civilization. Many left behind poetry, diaries, and prose that enriched the national literary tradition. Within their homes, they nurtured the traditional arts, tea ceremony, flower arrangement, classical music, passing them on to future generations. They supported artisans, mentored performers, and shaped evolving aesthetics in fashion, home design, and ceremony. Their refined taste didn't just stay within the warrior class, it spread. Wealthy merchant families began to imitate their styles, further amplifying their cultural impact. Politically, samurai women were subtle but powerful. They were the mothers of future lords, the wives of current officials, and the managers of vast domestic networks. Through these roles, they influenced decisions, shaped alliances, and safeguarded their families' legacies. And in moments of political crisis, some rose to astonishing heights. Lady Kasuga, a trusted nurse to the third Tokugawa shogun, and Lady Yodo, the mother of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, weren't mere bystanders. They were power brokers, navigating deadly rivalries and succession disputes with skill and nerve. Religion, too, offered both comfort and purpose. Buddhism's teachings on impermanence resonated deeply with the constraints women faced. Pure Land Buddhism, with its focus on faith over ritual, drew in many female devotees. Some women chose an entirely different path, becoming nuns instead of brides. Especially during the chaotic Sengoku period, religious life became a refuge from the instability of marriage and war. Some female monastics founded temples, gained spiritual authority, and taught disciples of both sexes. However, as Japan entered the Tokugawa era and long peace settled in, the scope of women's roles narrowed. Confucian ideals crept in, reinforcing male dominance and domesticating female influence, especially in urban households. Still, rural women often found ways to defy these norms, driven by practical needs. Status was written on the body. Married women blackened their teeth with dye, shaved their eyebrows, and painted new ones high on their foreheads, markings of maturity and marital status. Their kimono, with its family crest and subdued colors, silently communicated lineage and rank. Every accessory, every hairstyle was a code, an emblem of the role they played in the grand stage of samurai society. In the world of the samurai, women were never merely ornaments. They were educators, warriors, artists, politicians, and spiritual guides, shaping a civilization even from behind the curtains. In the world of the samurai, much of the real power didn't reside in the battlefield. It unfolded in quieter places, far from the clang of armor and the roar of commands. For samurai women, daily life centered on the interior quarters of the household. These private rooms, off limits to outsiders and separate from the formal reception areas where men handled political matters, were far more than domestic prisons. They were women's domains, spaces of influence, creativity, and cultural preservation. Here, poems were written, melodies played, rituals observed. While the spatial divide symbolized gender roles and restrictions, it also fostered a unique authority that women wielded behind closed screens. These inner quarters were paradoxes, both symbols of confinement and centers of refined power. The experiences of samurai women challenge any simplistic reading of gender in feudal Japan. Yes, they were subordinate within formal hierarchies, but within the walls of their homes, they commanded respect as educators, managers, artists, and mothers. Their roles were layered with complexity, embodying the broader duality of Tokugawa society, where rigid ranks coexisted with human networks of obligation, necessity, and influence. And while these domestic centers thrived quietly, the nation was anything but still. Beneath the surface came of Tokugawa peace lay a world of hidden unrest. The peace wasn't born of harmony. It was enforced through surveillance, legal control, and the calculated threat of violence. The shogunate created elaborate systems to detect rebellion, suppress dissent, and maintain the carefully stacked order of feudal Japan. But sometimes that system cracked. The most dramatic early example came in 1637, when discontent boiled over in the Shimabara Peninsula and Amakusa Islands. The cause? A volatile mix of religious persecution, oppressive taxation, and local misrule. A charismatic teenager named Amakusa Shiro led around 37,000 rebels, Christian peasants and masterless samurai, in defiance of their lords. Their stronghold, the fortress at Hara Castle. The shogunate's response was overwhelming. Over 125,000 troops laid siege to the castle for months. When it finally fell, there was no mercy. Men, women, even children, nearly all were executed. The message was brutal and clear. Christianity would not be tolerated, and rebellion would be crushed completely. In the aftermath, the government intensified its efforts to eliminate Christianity. Every citizen had to register with a Buddhist temple. Those suspected of harboring forbidden beliefs were forced to step on Christian images, a ritual known as fumi-e, to prove their loyalty. Refusal brought torture, even death. Yet the faith survived, hidden in secret communities that blended Christian symbols with Buddhist and Shinto practices, an underground religion that endured for over 200 years. But religion wasn't the only fault line. Across the countryside, Japan's peasants, the backbone of the economy, rose up repeatedly. Thousands of protests erupted throughout the Edo period, fueled by crushing taxes, corrupt officials, famines, and natural disasters. Most began peacefully, through formal petitions and appeals. But when these were ignored, they sometimes flared into violent uprisings. In movements known as Yonoshi, world rectification, peasants attacked the property of merchants, stormed local offices, and demanded justice. The government's response was carefully measured. Initial force subdued the crowds, but it was often followed by calculated reforms, reducing the worst taxes, replacing the most corrupt officials. While the rebellion leaders were punished, the people were sometimes appeased. This blend of selective repression and strategic concession helped the shogunate maintain its legitimacy while preventing larger collapses. Local officials played a crucial role, standing between the peasants' fury and the distant central authorities. They negotiated, absorbed blame, and translated complaints into language the elite could hear. In this way, the Tokugawa regime preserved its fragile equilibrium. Through the hidden strength of samurai women, the silent tensions of the peasant class, and the invisible machinery of surveillance and control, Tokugawa Japan achieved a kind of dynamic stability, one that endured for over 2 centuries but always lived on the edge of eruption. Urban unrest in Tokugawa Japan wasn't just a concern, it was a constant threat simmering beneath the surface of daily life. The cities were packed with artisans, day laborers, and servants, all living on the edge of subsistence. Whenever food prices surged or injustice appeared too blatant to ignore, these communities could erupt into chaos. A striking example is the Uchikawashi riots in Edo, which occurred in 1733 and again in 1787. In both cases, rising rice prices sparked mobs to systematically destroy the property of wealthy merchants. These weren't just random outbursts. They were targeted, coordinated acts of fury aimed at those perceived to be profiting off the misery of others. And this rage didn't always take physical form. Satirical writings, anonymous and biting, appeared on walls across the cities, mocking officials, merchants, and even the system itself. Authorities struggled to track down the authors, let alone silence the discontent. The densely packed cities were powder kegs, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, unrest among the samurai class took a different shape. These were not peasants rioting in the streets, but internal power struggles, succession disputes, policy disagreements, factional rivalries. When conflicts reached a deadlock, factions would often turn to the shogunate, hoping to tip the scales by appealing to centralized authority. But there was one subset of samurai that posed a far greater challenge: the ronin. These masterless warriors, unanchored by the traditional lord-retainer bond, were difficult to control. Some plotted assassinations or broader rebellions. Most of these plots were discovered and suppressed, but occasionally one broke through, and none more famously than the 1702 vendetta of the 47 Ronin. Their lord, Asano Naganori, had been forced to commit seppuku after attacking a shogunal official who insulted him. For 2 years, his former retainers appeared to dissolve into the background, seeming to abandon their warrior code. In reality, they were planning revenge. When they finally struck, killing their lord's enemy in a meticulously coordinated attack, they reignited the entire nation's imagination. The incident placed the shogunate in a bind. Private vendettas were illegal, but these men had displayed unwavering loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice, all core tenets of Bushido. After prolonged deliberation, the shogunate ordered them to commit seppuku, allowing them to die with honor while reinforcing the rule of law. Their story exploded across Japan, becoming legend almost overnight. Through kabuki plays, woodblock prints, and oral tales, the 47 Ronin were elevated as paragons of samurai virtue. Yet these portrayals also subtly criticized the Tokugawa system. The shogunate's bureaucrats were often depicted as cold, legalistic, and detached from true warrior values. This romanticization of rebellion, so long as it upheld honor, exposed a deep cultural nostalgia for a more heroic age of samurai action. But the Tokugawa authorities were far from complacent. They maintained a vast intelligence network to detect threats before they could bloom. The Metsuki, inspectors acting as undercover agents, traveled the land, gathering information on everything from public sentiment to possible conspiracies. In the capital Edo, police forces were stretched thin, so they relied heavily on informants drawn from outcast communities. These individuals operated in the shadows of society, watching gambling dens, unlicensed brothels, and other hubs of illicit activity. Across the domains, local governments maintained parallel systems, creating an intricate web of surveillance. And then there was the law. The Tokugawa shogunate issued detailed legal codes that governed daily life with precision, from who could wear what clothing to how one could travel between domains. Punishments were swift, severe, and public, aiming to terrify more than rehabilitate. Suspects were often tortured during interrogation, with few rights or protections. Mobility across Japan was tightly regulated. The seiki sho, or barrier stations, were checkpoints placed on major roads, examining travel documents, searching for weapons, and scrutinizing the movement of women and children. These barriers were especially strict near major cities like Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka, and between key domains. Their main goal? Enforce the Sankin Kotai system, ensuring that daimyo families remained in Edokdo and that no rebellious movements slipped unnoticed between regions. In this rigid, tightly watched world, unrest, whether from urban commoners, disaffected ronin, or samurai factions, was both inevitable and feared. The Tokugawa peace depended not only on law and tradition, but on constant vigilance. Within the rigid but resilient structure of Tokugawa rule, Japan maintained a remarkable degree of internal stability, particularly when compared to its global contemporaries. Violent crime was rare, and despite the strict hierarchy of the feudal order, many Japanese experienced it less as oppression and more as a framework offering predictability and purpose. From village to domain, social cohesion was enforced not solely by samurai authority, but through deeply rooted group responsibility and communal self-regulation. Minor disputes were often resolved locally through mediation and social sanctions, reducing the necessity for punitive top-down interventions. This dual approach, rigid yet flexible, enabled the Tokugawa system to preserve feudal order while subtly adapting to new challenges. At its peak, this model of dynamic stability formed a society both deeply traditional and quietly transformative. Despite underlying tensions, large-scale rebellions were rare, underscoring the success of centuries-long refinement in feudal governance. As peace under the Tokugawa shogunate continued into its second century, significant economic and social shifts took root beneath an apparently unchanged surface. Although the four-tiered status hierarchy and formal institutions endured, real-world distributions of wealth, power, and cultural influence began to shift dramatically. The most critical of these changes was the steady growth of a sophisticated commercial economy, increasingly independent from the agrarian base of feudalism. Osaka emerged as Japan's commercial heart, transforming rice, the cornerstone of feudal taxation, into a liquid commodity through bustling markets. Merchants developed advanced financial tools, including futures contracts and commercial paper, creating a financial infrastructure that rivaled contemporary European systems. Wealthy merchant families such as Mitsui, Sumitomo, and Kono gained increasing economic clout as domain governments became financially dependent on them, upending the feudal ideology that placed merchants at society's bottom. Meanwhile, Japan's cities expanded rapidly, with Edo surpassing 1 million residents to become the largest city in the world. Other urban centers such as Osaka and Kyoto also grew, generating unprecedented concentrations of townspeople, merchants, artisans, entertainers, collectively known as the Chonin. These urbanites developed vibrant, distinctive cultures, fueled by disposable income and freedom from rural social constraints. Their patronage of theaters, restaurants, pleasure districts, and artistic ventures created a flourishing popular culture that began to eclipse the tastes of the traditional elite. In contrast, the samurai class faced mounting economic strain. Paid in rice, whose market value fluctuated beyond their control, many samurai sank into debt, often to the very merchant class they ostensibly outranked. The paradox of the socially superior being financially dependent on the inferior eroded the legitimacy of the feudal hierarchy. Domain governments, too, struggled with rising costs, resorting to inflationary practices such as currency debasement, forced loans, and heavier peasant taxation. These measures only deepened economic instability and status anxiety among samurai, desperate to maintain appearances appropriate to their rank. The widening rift between ideological feudalism and economic reality prompted repeated reform attempts by the shogunate. Efforts such as sumptuary laws banning luxury among merchants, currency reforms aimed at stabilizing rice prices, and moral campaigns promoting frugality were deployed to reinstate traditional order. The most notable reformers, Matsudaira Sadanobu in the 1790s and Mizuno Tadakuni in the 1840s, achieved only temporary results. Once reform efforts waned, commercial growth and socio-economic change resumed with renewed vigor. Beneath the surface of apparent continuity, Japan was transforming in ways that would ultimately lay the groundwork for its modern era. Even in rural areas, change was underway, setting the stage for further shifts that would challenge and eventually dismantle the feudal paradigm. During the Middle and Late Edo period, Japan experienced profound agricultural and cultural transformations that reshaped its feudal society from the ground up. Advances in farming, including improved seed varieties, enhanced fertilization methods, irrigation techniques, and the adoption of double cropping, substantially increased agricultural productivity. Farmers increasingly turned away from mere subsistence toward commercial agriculture, cultivating specialized crops like cotton, indigo, sugar, tobacco, and rapeseed for broader markets. This transition brought both opportunity and division. Within villages, socioeconomic distinctions deepened between prosperous land-owning families and marginal cultivators who relied on handicrafts, seasonal labor, or migration to urban centers to make ends meet. These rural changes fostered new patterns of inequality and economic interdependence, stretching far beyond traditional feudal ties. At the same time, proto-industrial production began to flourish in both rural and urban contexts. Textiles, sake brewing, paper making, and ceramics became key industries. Merchant organized putting out systems emerged, wherein raw materials were distributed to rural households and retrieved later as finished or semi-finished goods. Urban workshops followed suit, establishing increasingly specialized production lines with master craftsmen directing apprentices and journeymen. Though these enterprises remained household-based rather than factory-centered, they marked a crucial step toward industrial organization and fostered new forms of labor discipline outside the old status system. This evolving economic reality was mirrored in the cultural explosion of the Edo period. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints captured the vibrant floating world, portraying pleasure quarters, famed kabuki actors, celebrated courtesans, and eventually iconic landscapes and historical scenes. Literature flourished through genres like sherbon, amusing stories about brothel culture, and kibiyoshi, illustrated satirical books often lampooning samurai pretensions. Yomihon, long-form narrative tales filled with adventure and the supernatural, became popular despite periodic censorship targeting subversive or immoral content. Kabuki theater reached a new artistic peak during this era, achieving technical sophistication, iconic acting styles, and a repertoire of classic plays still performed today. Star actors like Ichikawa Danjuro attained celebrity status, captivating the urban public not only with their stagecraft, but with their offstage personas. Although officially deemed low-class entertainment, Kabuki eventually attracted samurai patrons who attended in disguise. The theaters became unique social spaces where class boundaries blurred, allowing interactions unimaginable within the formal status hierarchy. In tandem, the licensed pleasure quarters of Edo's Yoshiwara and Osaka's Shinmachi evolved into complex cultural arenas governed by elaborate codes of conduct and fashion. High-ranking courtesans, trained in the arts, poetry, and music, commanded fees only wealthy merchants could afford. Their salons became centers of refined cultural exchange, where patrons showcased their taste and intellect in a setting that inverted traditional status norms. Merchant wealth now bought access to cultural capital once reserved for aristocratic education. While popular culture thrived, elite traditions also adapted. The tea ceremony, long associated with samurai aesthetics, found new patrons among wealthy merchants who commissioned ornate tea rooms and collected rare implements. Classical poetic forms endured but increasingly reflected the themes and perspectives of the urban commoner. Intellectual life also broadened, with pursuits such as medicine, botany, mathematics, and historical inquiry drawing participants from both the samurai class and educated townspeople, forging intellectual communities that transcended social divisions. A particularly significant development was the emergence of Rangaku, or Dutch learning. Through the isolated Dutch trading post at Dejima in Nagasaki, Japan, accessed its only sanctioned channel to European knowledge. What began as a utilitarian interest in Western medicine soon expanded to include astronomy, geography, botany, physics, and military science. Although the shogunate imposed strict controls, censoring sensitive material and requiring official approval for studies, Western ideas quietly spread among the scholarly elite, enriching Japan's intellectual landscape even amid formal national seclusion. Religious life during this era presented a complex mix of continuity and transformation. Official Buddhist sects retained institutional authority and structured parish relationships, but their rituals often became formulaic and detached from daily spiritual life. Meanwhile, popular religious expressions flourished. Pilgrimages to famous temples and shrines drew large crowds, reflecting a vibrant undercurrent of grassroots spirituality that operated outside the bounds of formal orthodoxy. This interplay of economic innovation, cultural creativity, intellectual expansion, and religious pluralism profoundly reshaped Japanese society, setting the stage for the eventual emergence of modernity while still operating within the formal constraints of feudal order. In the final century of the Edo period, the cultural and intellectual undercurrents that had long flowed beneath the surface of Japanese feudal life began to swell against the rigid constraints of the Tokugawa order. Household divination practices and local festivals honoring ancestral spirits and vital energies, or kei, persisted as essential elements of popular spirituality. New religious movements periodically emerged, often led by charismatic figures who blended elements of Buddhism, Shinto, and folk belief, promising healing or salvation. These movements were typically viewed with suspicion by the authorities, who suppressed them as potential threats to social order. At the same time, the formal feudal structure increasingly struggled to contain the complex realities of Edo society. Wealthy merchant families, often generations deep in cultural sophistication, bristled under a hierarchy that placed them below samurai who were by then often impoverished and idle. Educated commoners questioned the legitimacy of status distinctions rooted in birth rather than merit. Domain governments, plagued by chronic fiscal deficits, watched helplessly as the thriving commercial class generated vast wealth they could tax only indirectly. The samurai class, once the core of Japan's military elite, faced a crisis of identity as their martial role became obsolete. Administrative tasks increasingly passed to capable commoners, clerks and managers who lacked rank but not competence. These internal tensions might have continued to evolve gradually within the Tokugawa framework, if not for the disruptive arrival of foreign powers. From the late 18th century onward, Russian, British, and American ships appeared with increasing frequency off Japan's coasts, challenging the shogunate's ability to preserve its isolation. The once comfortable seclusion that had allowed Japanese feudalism to evolve in its own unique fashion now proved untenable in the face of a rapidly integrating world order. Japan stood on the brink of a dramatic historical rupture, one driven by both internal contradictions and external pressures. Yet the peace of the Tokugawa era also created space for unparalleled intellectual activity. Without the constant warfare of earlier centuries, samurai scholars and commoners engaged in vigorous debates about ethics, governance, and Japan's place in the broader world. These discussions quietly eroded traditional assumptions about authority and social order. Initially intended to support feudal legitimacy, these evolving schools of thought would ultimately fuel its transformation. Neo-Confucianism, especially the Jushi school imported from China's Song dynasty, served as the official ideology of the Tokugawa regime. It offered a comprehensive worldview grounded in moral cultivation, hierarchical social relations, and the notion of a cosmic order linking heaven, nature, and humanity. The Tokugawa government institutionalized this ideology through the Shoheiko Academy in Edo, which trained samurai officials in Confucian texts. Similar domain schools spread across Japan, reinforcing the ethical obligations of rulers to govern justly and the duty of subjects to obey with loyalty. Yet within this Confucian framework, intellectual diversity thrived. The Kogaku, or ancient learning school, for example, urged a return to the original texts of Confucius and Mencius, bypassing centuries of interpretative commentaries. Thinkers such as Yamaga Soko and Arai Sarai challenged orthodoxy by contextualizing social institutions historically rather than treating them as expressions of timeless cosmic truths. Arai Sarai in particular emphasized the historical development of society and government, subtly undermining the historical legitimacy of Tokugawa rule. While still operating within Confucian paradigms, these critiques injected critical perspectives into Japanese political philosophy. Another major intellectual movement was Shingaku, or heart learning, founded by Ishida Baigen. This school merged Confucian ethics with Buddhist and Shinto spirituality, creating a practical moral code tailored to the needs of merchants and artisans. At a time when official ideology still stigmatized commerce, Shingaku legitimized economic activity as socially beneficial when conducted with integrity. Through public lectures and moral tales, Shingaku teachers promoted honesty, diligence, and social responsibility, values suited not to the warrior but to the working townsman. In so doing, Shingaku helped construct an ethical foundation for commercial society. Meanwhile, traditional Buddhism, though institutionally entrenched through systems like temple registration, faced significant intellectual stagnation. Once the locus of philosophical creativity, the major Buddhist schools such as Tendai, Shingon, Pure Land, and Zen had largely receded from their former role as centers of innovation. Their integration into the Tokugawa state apparatus contributed to a perception of Buddhism as formalistic and ritual-bound. Despite this, popular religious practice flourished outside official channels. Pilgrimages to famous temples and shrines drew wide participation, reinforcing a grassroots spirituality unencumbered by rigid orthodoxy. These religious and intellectual fermentations, fueled by peace, prosperity, and contradiction, did not yet overthrow the Tokugawa order, but they sowed the ideological seeds that would soon blossom into radical transformation. The late Tokugawa period witnessed an intensification of intellectual ferment as traditional frameworks encountered both internal critique and external influence. Mainstream Buddhist institutions, while officially entrenched through their roles in temple registration and mortuary rites, suffered from increasing intellectual stagnation. Their economic stability, secured through monopolies on death rituals, dulled their drive for spiritual or philosophical innovation. In contrast, the most vibrant currents in Buddhist thought arose from reformist movements that openly challenged ossified hierarchies and sought to recover the foundational essence of spiritual practice. Parallel to this internal religious critique, a major intellectual movement, Kokugaku, or national learning, emerged as a counterpoint to the dominance of Chinese Confucian ideology in official discourse. Scholars like Motori, Norinaga, and Kamo no Mabuchi spearheaded this effort, advocating for the rediscovery of a pure Japanese spirit through philological studies of ancient texts such as the Kojiki and Manyoshu. By meticulously analyzing these works, they sought to extract indigenous Japanese concepts that had long been obscured by Chinese literary structures and moralist overlays. Kokugaku scholars celebrated what they identified as uniquely Japanese emotional depth, aesthetic sensitivity, and spiritual intuition, often in contrast to what they criticized as the rationalistic and didactic character of Chinese thought. Initially literary and linguistic in focus, Kokugaku gradually evolved into a more explicitly political project. Thinkers like Hirata Atsutane expanded the school's concerns to include ancient Shinto beliefs and cosmologies centered on the divine origins of Japan's imperial line. Hirata's writings asserted Japan's spiritual superiority and emphasized the sacred nature of the emperor and the Japanese polity. While such ideas began as scholarly recovery efforts, they ultimately laid the ideological foundation for a new form of nationalism that would question the shogunate's legitimacy and elevate the emperor as the true sovereign. In this way, Kokugaku would play a critical role in the eventual collapse of feudal rule. Concurrently, the narrow channel of Rangaku, or Dutch learning, continued to funnel Western knowledge into Japan despite the country's formal isolation. Though initially focused on medical applications, Japanese scholars gradually expanded their interests to include astronomy, geography, botany, physics, and military science. Dutch translations of European texts introduced concepts such as Copernican astronomy, Newtonian physics, Linnaean taxonomy, and anatomical realism to a growing circle of Japanese intellectuals. The empirical accuracy of these sciences proved difficult to dismiss. The watershed moment came with Sugita Genpaku's Kaitai Shinsho, a Japanese translation of a Dutch anatomy book based on a German original. After conducting dissections, Genpaku and his colleagues confirmed the anatomical illustration's precision, a revelation he likened to seeing a light in darkness. This moment of empirical confirmation spurred deeper engagement with Western science and chipped away at traditional cosmological explanations rooted in East Asian classical texts. More than its content, Rangaku's real revolution lay in its method. Emphasizing direct observation, mathematical rigor, and systematic classification, it introduced a new epistemology. Japanese scholars began applying these principles to local investigations, conducting detailed surveys of Japan's physical and biological landscapes. Figures like Ino Tadataka, who conducted the country's first accurate coastal mapping using astronomical tools, and Takahashi Yoshitoki, who calculated solar and lunar orbits with unmatched precision, exemplified the rise of a new empirical tradition. These achievements gradually shifted intellectual authority away from inherited texts and toward experiential validation. Historical scholarship, too, experienced a renaissance, particularly through the work of the Mitogaku, or Mito school, sponsored by the daimyo of Mito domain. Undertaking the massive compilation of the Dai Nihonshi, a comprehensive history of Japan, Mito scholars remained formally loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate but subtly advanced an alternative narrative. By emphasizing the imperial line's unbroken descent and moral centrality, they quietly questioned the Tokugawa regime's alignment with the true source of political legitimacy. This historical perspective, coupled with growing awareness of Western imperial encroachment, helped crystallize the Sano-Joi ideology, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, that would inspire anti-shogunate activism in the late Edo period. Alongside abstract theory, practical learning also flourished. Scholars of Jitsugaku, or practical learning, compiled manuals on agriculture, commerce, and governance aimed at solving real-world problems. Agricultural thinkers like Miyazaki Yasusada produced detailed guides on crop varieties, farming techniques, and land management, helping rural communities navigate the complexities of an evolving economy. Together, these intellectual movements, Kokugaku, Rangaku, Mitogaku, and Jitsugaku, formed a rich and varied intellectual landscape. Each, in its own way, questioned the philosophical, scientific, historical, or administrative foundations of Tokugawa authority. Though not yet revolutionary in their methods, they planted the seeds of a transformation that would soon erupt with irreversible force. In the twilight years of the Tokugawa era, economic thought in Japan reached new levels of sophistication, as scholars grappled with the challenges of a rapidly evolving society. Thinkers such as Kumazawa Banzan, Honda Toshiaki, and Sato Nobuhiro advanced detailed analyses of production systems, trade mechanisms, and monetary policy. These economic perspectives were deeply rooted in Confucian ethical frameworks, yet increasingly grounded in empirical observation and practical problem-solving. This fusion gave rise to a uniquely Japanese discourse on governance and policy that would later influence the strategies of modernization during the Meiji period. By the early 19th century, Japan's intellectuals could no longer ignore the looming specter of Western imperial expansion in Asia. The Opium War of 1839 to 1842, which saw the Qing dynasty humbled by British power, sent shockwaves through Japanese political and scholarly circles. Prominent figures such as Sakuma Shozan and Yokoi Shonen argued for a strategic response to adopt Western military technologies and organizational methods while safeguarding Japan's cultural and spiritual heritage. This approach crystallized in the phrase Eastern ethics, Western science, a succinct expression of the synthesis these thinkers envisioned, a Japan militarily prepared and economically modernized, yet still rooted in its traditional values. This hybrid vision marked a crucial intellectual bridge between the feudal past and a modernizing future. During the final decades of Tokugawa rule, Japan's intellectual landscape became a dense tapestry of competing and converging ideas. Neo-Confucian orthodoxy retained its official position but faced mounting challenges from all directions. Kokugaku, with its emphasis on native traditions, questioned the legitimacy of Chinese cultural dominance. Rangaku demonstrated the practical superiority of Western science and method. Historical research, especially by the Maido school, subtly undermined the shogunate's claim to legitimacy by emphasizing the imperial line's moral and historical centrality. Meanwhile, economic scholarship revealed the deep contradictions between the formal hierarchy of the feudal system and the actual distribution of wealth and power in society. Together, these intellectual developments provided a rich repertoire of concepts for imagining an alternative social and political order. They would directly shape the thinking of the leaders who dismantled the Tokugawa regime and spearheaded the Meiji Restoration. Many of these reformers came from lower-ranking samurai families, men of education but limited prospects within the rigid feudal system. Their exposure to a range of ideas, from Neo-Confucian ideals of ethical governance to Kokugaku's exaltation of imperial legitimacy and Rangaku's empirical engagement with Western knowledge, equipped them with a nuanced understanding of both Japan's internal weaknesses and external dangers. Ironically, the same feudal system that had permitted this intellectual flowering would be undone by the very ideas it had nurtured. As the 19th century advanced, the Tokugawa regime found itself beset by a convergence of crises: economic strain, social unrest, ideological challenge, and foreign threat. The political structure that had ensured over 2 centuries of stability began to unravel. In the closing years of Tokugawa rule, signs of systemic crisis became undeniable. Reform efforts grew increasingly desperate, and the ability of the shogunate to manage the complexities of the age faltered. Yet even as the formal institutions of feudalism collapsed, the values and cultural frameworks of the samurai class would continue to influence Japanese identity well into the modern era. Financial distress was a hallmark of the regime's final decades. Despite multiple rounds of currency debasement, coercive loans from merchant houses, and initiatives to boost agricultural yields, both the central shogunate and many domain governments were burdened by chronic budget shortfalls. The traditional economic foundation of samurai power, control over agricultural surplus via rice taxation, proved increasingly inadequate in a society where wealth was increasingly generated through commerce and urban enterprise. Lower-ranking samurai bore the brunt of this economic decline. Their stipends, fixed in rice, failed to keep pace with inflation and market shifts, turning them into a restless class of educated but undercompensated men who no longer saw a vested interest in preserving the system. These economic difficulties were compounded by natural disasters that shook public confidence. The Tenpo famine, 1833 to 1837, triggered by anomalously cold weather, devastated rice harvests and led to widespread starvation, sparking numerous peasant uprisings. The Ansei earthquake of 1855 inflicted massive destruction on Edo, toppling samurai residences and official buildings alike. Many interpreted the calamity as a supernatural judgment on the Tokugawa order. These disasters overwhelmed the regime's relief mechanisms and exposed deep administrative failings. In a society where rulers were expected to protect and provide, the inability of the shogunate to fulfill these basic duties intensified public discontent and fueled calls for change. Despite various attempts at reform, the Tokugawa authorities proved unable to reverse the downward spiral. Each policy initiative, however well-intentioned, was either too narrow, too late, or too constrained by the very system it sought to preserve. The foundations of feudal Japan were no longer tenable in the face of a transformed domestic and international landscape, and the end of the Tokugawa era was no longer a question of if, but when. In the waning years of Tokugawa rule, reformist efforts grew increasingly urgent and desperate. The Tenpo reforms, spearheaded by senior counselor Mizuno Tadakunian between 1841 and 1843, aimed to reinvigorate the shogunate through a combination of currency stabilization, sumptuary laws restricting merchant extravagance, forced price controls, and bureaucratic restructuring. While initially implemented with vigor, these reforms encountered stiff resistance from entrenched economic interests and failed to address the deeper structural contradictions of a society in transition. Their limited impact highlighted the fundamental difficulty of preserving feudal institutions in the face of dynamic social and economic change. The decisive blow, however, came not from within, but from without. In the 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay aboard 4 black ships, steam-powered war vessels that starkly displayed the military superiority of the West. Bearing a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore, Perry demanded the establishment of diplomatic relations and guarantees for the safety of shipwrecked American sailors. When he returned the following year with a larger fleet, the shogunate, recognizing its strategic vulnerability, agreed to the Convention of Kanagawa. This treaty opened 2 ports to American ships and established a U.S. consulate. Soon thereafter, similar unequal treaties were signed with other Western nations. These concessions ignited a political crisis that shook the foundation of Tokugawa legitimacy. The shogunate had unilaterally breached Japan's long-standing seclusion policy, sakoku, without prior imperial consent, thereby undermining its own claim to be the realm's protector. In a bid to retroactively legitimize the treaties, the emperor's endorsement was hastily sought, but the process exposed internal divisions and eroded public confidence. The slogan Sono Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, quickly gained traction, especially among lower-ranking samurai in domains historically less beholden to Tokugawa authority. Anti-foreign violence escalated, targeting Western diplomats and merchants, which in turn provoked punitive military responses and exposed Japan's strategic and technological inferiority. Political polarization deepened as various factions advanced competing strategies for confronting the foreign threat. Reformers such as Hada Masayoshi and Ine Naosuke advocated for modernization and diplomatic engagement, while conservative elements called for a return to strict isolation. In an unprecedented move, the shogunate sought to consult with the daimyo lords, an attempt at consensus that broke with centuries of top-down governance. Yet this act of political inclusion only revealed the erosion of central authority. When Naosuke pushed through controversial policies via the Ansei Purge, removing dissenters by force, he was assassinated in 1860 by anti-foreign samurai, a clear signal that the shogunate could no longer contain the growing unrest. Several powerful domains emerged as focal points of resistance to Tokugawa hegemony. Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen initially harbored both pro-imperial and pro-foreign factions, but over time, a unified vision coalesced. These domains began advocating for the restoration of imperial rule, combined with selective adoption of Western technology and governance methods to defend Japan against colonial encroachment. Reform movements were often led by lower-ranking samurai, educated yet marginalized within the rigid Tokugawa hierarchy, who saw in modernization both a means of national salvation and personal advancement. Military confrontations with the West further galvanized this realization. The bombardment of Satsuma by British forces in 1863 and the shelling of Choshu's coastal defenses in 1864 convinced many domain leaders that expelling foreigners was futile without first modernizing Japan's military and political systems. The shogunate's final attempts at modernization came too late. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, undertook military reforms by purchasing Western weapons and enlisting French military advisors. Diplomatic missions were dispatched to Europe and America, acquiring first-hand knowledge of Western political and industrial systems. Progressive figures like Katsu Kaishu championed a complete overhaul of governance along Western lines. Yet by this point, the regime had lost its moral authority, and the tide had turned decisively toward imperial restoration. In November 1867, Yoshinobu formally resigned as shogun, hoping to retain influence within a new imperial framework. However, events soon outpaced him. On January 3, 1868, radical elements from Satsuma and Choshu seized the imperial palace in Kyoto and proclaimed the restoration of direct imperial rule. When Yoshinobu mobilized troops to reassert control, the brief but pivotal Boshin War erupted. Despite fielding superior numbers, Bakufu forces suffered defeat at the decisive Battle of Toba Fushimi, as many of their allies defected or chose neutrality. Further resistance in Edo was averted through the diplomatic efforts of Katsu Kaishu, who negotiated a peaceful surrender. Nonetheless, scattered fighting continued in northern Japan until mid-1869. The fall of the Tokugawa stronghold at Hakodate marked the final military defeat of the shogunate and the definitive end of Japan's feudal era. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, named after the reign title of the young Emperor Mutsuhito, marked both the culmination of samurai-led political upheaval and a profound transformation of Japanese society. While the new restoration government initially included representatives from the imperial court and various feudal domains, power quickly centralized in the hands of leaders from the four principal anti-Tokugawa domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu. Reform-minded samurai such as Saigo Takamori, Kido Takayoshi, Ito Hirobumi, and Yamagata Aritomo understood that safeguarding Japan's sovereignty in an era of Western imperial expansion necessitated a fundamental reorganization of the state along Western lines. The dismantling of Japan's centuries-old feudal order proceeded with unprecedented speed and decisiveness. In 1869, the daimyo voluntarily returned their domains to the emperor, receiving appointments as provincial governors in return. By 1871, the domains were abolished entirely and replaced with centrally administered prefectures, bringing Japan under a unitary administrative framework. In that same year, the hierarchical caste structure of Tokugawa society was officially abolished. Samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants were legally unified as imperial subjects, all nominally equal before the law. While commoners largely welcomed the newfound social mobility and economic opportunity, former elites, especially the samurai, experienced the changes as a seismic upheaval of identity and privilege. For the samurai class, the Meiji Restoration did not merely erase status, it redefined existence. The abolition of the right to wear swords in 1876 symbolically stripped the samurai of their most visible marker of identity. Simultaneously, military reform eliminated domain-based armies, replacing them with a conscript national army modeled on European systems. The exclusive samurai monopoly on martial service was thus decisively broken. More profoundly, the economic basis of samurai life, hereditary stipends, was first converted into interest-bearing bonds and eventually into one-time lump sum payments, severing the link between birthright and income. These reforms triggered armed backlash from conservative samurai elements unwilling to relinquish traditional roles. The Saga Rebellion of 1874, led by former restorationist Ito Shinpei, briefly challenged central authority before being swiftly suppressed. Far more serious was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, in which the revered Saigo Takamori led thousands of disaffected warriors in open revolt. Despite early victories, Saigo's forces were ultimately overwhelmed by the modern imperial army, and he chose suicide over surrender. This defeat marked the symbolic and literal end of the samurai as a military caste. Despite the dissolution of their formal status, many samurai families adapted to the new era in innovative ways. Some invested their compensation into businesses with varying degrees of success. Others transitioned into roles as bureaucrats, police officers, diplomats, educators, and military officers, fields where their literacy in training and discipline proved invaluable. A smaller number became successful entrepreneurs, leveraging personal networks and education to found companies that would play key roles in Japan's industrial growth. Through these various paths, former samurai contributed significantly to Japan's modernization, even as they contended with profound dislocation of their traditional identity. The Meiji state, far from erasing the samurai legacy, consciously repurposed it. The Bushido ethic, once a code of conduct exclusive to the warrior class, was reinterpreted as a national moral standard. Loyalty, discipline, and self-sacrifice were reframed as civic virtues expected of every imperial subject. The 1890 Imperial Rescript on Education enshrined these values within the school curriculum, emphasizing obedience to the emperor, filial piety, and willingness to die for the nation. Military institutions adopted a hybrid ethos, combining samurai moral ideals with Western tactical training. In this way, the ideological spirit of the samurai lived on, even as the institutional structures of feudalism disappeared. Cultural expression during the Meiji period reflected this ambivalence. Early literature often celebrated the end of feudal restrictions and the rise of new social possibilities. Yet, as Japan solidified its independence and gained respect on the international stage, a wave of nostalgia emerged. Historical novels glorified samurai virtues. Theater performances dramatized legendary warrior deeds. Popular media portrayed Bushido as the quintessential Japanese ethical tradition. This duality, rejecting feudal institutions while embracing their moral legacy, encapsulated modern Japan's complex relationship with its past. The samurai were no longer the ruling class, but their values, aesthetics, and mythology became woven into the cultural fabric of a rapidly modernizing nation. The global reception of samurai imagery has followed a trajectory of romanticization that often obscures historical complexities. Western observers such as Lafcadio Hearn played a major role in popularizing idealized depictions of samurai as noble warrior philosophers, embodiments of exotic Eastern wisdom and martial discipline. The 1900 publication of Nidobe Inazo's Bushido, The Soul of Japan in English, presented samurai ethics as Japan's equivalent of Western chivalry, highlighting spiritual and aesthetic values while minimizing the harsher realities of feudal power dynamics. These selective international interpretations echoed and reinforced Japan's own cultural reevaluation of its samurai heritage. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, the legacy of the samurai has retained profound cultural resonance in Japan, even as it has been continually reinterpreted. During the era of imperial expansion, militarists appropriated Bushido's martial virtues to promote loyalty, sacrifice, and aggression in the context of modern warfare. In the post-World War II period, a more humanistic reading of the samurai tradition emerged, emphasizing inner cultivation, aesthetic refinement, and spiritual discipline. Today, Japanese engagement with samurai heritage spans a broad spectrum, from serious historical scholarship to vibrant reimaginings in manga, anime, and video games that reach a global audience. Samurai imagery remains central to cultural tourism, traditional martial arts, and public performances, serving as a powerful symbol of Japanese uniqueness. Yet the real historical samurai were far more complex than either the romantic legends or their critiques suggest. They were neither purely noble sages nor ruthless enforcers of oppression. Rather, they were dynamic actors within a society that they helped build, sustain, and transform. Their governance structures, legal codes, ethical systems, and cultural patronage profoundly shaped Japanese civilization. The contradictions within samurai identity, between violence and refinement, duty and ambition, tradition and adaptation, reflect broader tensions inherent in human society. It is these enduring contradictions that give their stories such lasting relevance. The feudal society crafted and managed by the samurai for nearly 700 years represents one of history's most distinctive social experiments. In contrast to the gradual transition from feudalism to absolutism and then democracy in Europe, Japan's feudal system, particularly under the Tokugawa shogunate, reached a state of highly structured equilibrium before undergoing rapid dissolution during the Meiji Restoration. Remarkably, it was the samurai themselves who led this transformation, dismantling the very institutions that had defined their identity. This process preserved cultural continuity even as it instituted political revolution. The resulting modernization maintained core Japanese sensibilities while embracing Western technologies, legal frameworks, and administrative models. As the samurai class faded from the political stage, their cultural influence endured. The refined aesthetics developed under samurai patronage continued to inform contemporary Japanese design, architecture, and artisanal practices. Ethical principles rooted in Bushido, such as loyalty, perseverance, and self-restraint, have shaped modern corporate culture, educational philosophies, and social norms. Martial disciplines, born of battlefield necessity, evolved into global practices focused on personal growth, discipline, and philosophical reflection. The depth and breadth of samurai cultural influence reveal just how deeply embedded their legacy remains in Japanese life. Beyond Japan, the samurai have become global icons, emblems of discipline, honor, and mystique. Their narrative offers rich insights into how societies structure authority, encode values, and negotiate between continuity and change. From their origins as mounted provincial warriors, through their ascendancy during the Heian and Kamakura periods, the chaos of the Sengoku Wars, the administrative sophistication of the Tokugawa peace, and the radical reforms of the Meiji era, the samurai story traces a path of evolution both exceptional and instructive. This journey reveals the achievements and limitations of feudal organization, while illustrating how tradition can be reinterpreted to meet modern challenges. The legacy of the samurai is not confined to the past. It is an active cultural force, continually explored, reimagined, and contested in light of contemporary concerns. The final dissolution of feudal Japan did not come through a bloody revolution, but through a remarkable self-transformation led by the very class that had ruled it. In this peaceful passing lies perhaps the most distinctive feature of Japan's feudal history. The samurai as a formal class may have disappeared, but their values, vision, and aesthetic ideals remain woven into the fabric of Japanese identity and will likely continue shaping it for generations to come. The sword has been laid to rest, but the spirit that forged it endures, resonating through countless subtle channels that bind contemporary Japan to the legacy of its samurai past. Though the blades are no longer worn, the values, aesthetics, and social ideals honed over centuries of warrior rule remain embedded in the rhythms of modern Japanese life. In its architecture, its arts, its sense of discipline, and its ethical imagination, Japan continues to carry forward the refined sensibilities cultivated under samurai patronage. The discipline once wielded in battle now finds expression in business etiquette, the restraint and formality of daily interaction, and the artistry of everyday life. The loyalty once sworn to lords now animates a collective sense of duty to community and nation. In the quiet tenacity of the salaryman, the minimalist elegance of traditional design, and the reverence for craftsmanship in fields from cuisine to ceramics, the echoes of the samurai are unmistakable. The civilization they shaped, an intricate synthesis of martial austerity and cultural depth, was not extinguished with their formal dissolution, but rather transformed, reinterpreted, and reincorporated into the DNA of modern Japan. As Japan continues to evolve on the world stage, it does so not in opposition to its past, but in dialogue with it. The enduring spirit of the samurai, disciplined, adaptive, and steeped in a unique fusion of power and poetry, remains a quiet but persistent force linking present to past, identity to origin. The blade has been sheathed, yet its presence is still felt. The samurai may no longer rule, but their civilization lives on. And so, as we reflect on this extraordinary historical journey, from the earliest warrior bands to the architects of modern Japan, we are invited to consider what we inherit from the past and how we shape it into the future. If the legacy of the samurai teaches us anything, it is that discipline, adaptability, and a deep commitment to ideals can endure beyond eras and empires. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of one of history's most fascinating civilizations. If this story moved you, challenged you, or deepened your curiosity, we invite you to share it, reflect on it, and keep the conversation alive. History is never truly gone. It lives on every time we choose to remember.